Chapter 1 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O. F. Walton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 1 Rosalie. Rain, rain, rain! How mercilessly it fell on the fair field that Sunday afternoon! Every moment the pools increased and the mud became thicker. How dismal the fair looked then! On Saturday evening it had been brilliantly lighted with the rows of flaring naphtha lights, and the grand shows, in the most aristocratic part of the field, had been illuminated with crosses, stars, anchors, and all manner of devices. But there were no lights now. There was nothing to cast a halo round the dirty, weather-stained tents and the dingy caravans. Yet, in spite of this, and in spite of the rain, a crowd of Sunday idlers lingered about the fair, looking with great interest at the half-covered whirligigs and bicycles, peeping curiously into the deserted shows, and making many schemes for further enjoyment on the morrow, when the fair was once more to be in its glory. Inside the caravans the show people were crouching over their fires and grumbling at the weather, murmuring at having to pay so much for the ground on which their shows were erected, at a time when they would be likely to make so little profit. A little old man, with a rosy, good-tempered face, was making his way across the sea of mud which divided the shows from each other. He was evidently no idler in the fair. He had come into it that Sunday afternoon for a definite purpose, and he did not intend to leave it until it was accomplished. After crossing an almost impassable place, he climbed the steps leading to one of the caravans and knocked at the door. It was a curious door. The upper part of it, being used as a window, was filled with glass, behind which you could see two small muslin curtains tied up with pink ribbon. No one came to open the door when the old man knocked, and he was about to turn away when some little boys, who were standing near, called out to him, "Rap again, sir, rap again. There's a little lass in there. She went in a bit since." "Don't you wish you was her?" said one of the little boys to the other. "Aye," said the little fellow, "I wish our house would move about, and had little windows with white curtains and pink bows." The old man laughed a hearty laugh at the children's talk, and rapped again at the caravan door. This time a face appeared between the muslin curtains, and peered cautiously out. It was a very pretty little face, so pretty that the old man sighed to himself when he saw it. Then the small head turned round and seemed to be telling what it had seen to some one within, and asking leave to admit the visitor. For a minute afterwards the door was opened, and the owner of the pretty face stood before the old man. She was a little girl, about 12 years of age, very slender and delicate in appearance. Her hair, which was of a rich auburn color, was hanging down to her waist, and her eyes were the most beautiful the old man thought he had ever seen. She was very poorly dressed, and she shivered as the damp, cold air rushed in through the open door. "Good afternoon, my little dear," said the old man. She was just going to answer him when a violent fit of coughing from within caused her to look round, and when it was over, a querulous voice said hurriedly, "Shut the door, Rosalie. It's so cold. Ask whoever it is to come in." The old man did not wait for a second invitation. He stepped inside the caravan, and the child closed the door. It was a very small place. There was hardly room for him to stand. At the end of the caravan was a narrow bed, something like a berth on board ship, and on it a woman was lying, who was evidently very ill. She was the child's mother, the old man felt sure. She had the same beautiful eyes and sunny hair, though her face was thin and wasted. There was not room for much furniture in the small caravan. A tiny stove, the chimney of which went through the wooden roof, a few pans, a shelf containing cups and saucers, and two boxes which served as seats, completely filled it. There was only just room for the old man to stand, and the fire was so near him that he was in danger of being scorched. Rosalie had seated herself on one of the boxes close to her mother's bed. "You must excuse my intruding, ma'am," said the old man, with a polite bow, "but I'm so fond of little folks, and I've brought this little girl of yours a picture, if she will accept it from me." A flush of pleasure came into the child's face as he brought out of his pocket his promised gift. She seized it eagerly and held it up before her with evident delight, whilst her mother raised herself on her elbow to look at it with her. It was the picture of a shepherd, with a very kind and compassionate face, who was bearing home in his bosom a lost lamb. The lamb's fleece was torn in several places, and there were marks of blood on its back, as if it had been roughly used by some cruel beast in a recent struggle. But the shepherd seemed to have suffered more than the lamb, for he was wounded in many places, and his blood was falling in large drops on the ground. Yet he did not seem to mind it. His face was full of love and full of joy as he looked at the lamb. He had forgotten his sorrow in his joy that the lamb was saved. In the distance were some of the shepherd's friends who were coming to meet him, and underneath the picture were these words, printed in large letters: "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." The little girl read the words aloud in a clear, distinct voice, and her mother gazed at the picture with tears in her eyes. "Those are sweet words, ain't they?" said the old man. "Yes," said the woman with a sigh, "I have heard them many times before." "Has the Good Shepherd ever said them of you, ma'am? Has he ever called the bright angels together and said to them of you, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost'?" The woman did not speak. A fit of coughing came on, and the old man stood looking at her with a very pitying expression. "You are very ill, ma'am, I am afraid," he said. "Yes, very ill," gasped the woman bitterly. "Every one can see that but Augustus." "That's my father," said the little girl. "No, he doesn't see it," repeated the woman. "He thinks I ought to get up and act in the play just as usual. I did try at the last place we went to, but I fainted as soon as my part was over, and I've been in bed ever since." "You must be tired of moving about, ma'am," said the old man compassionately. "Tired?" said she. "I should think I was tired. It isn't what I was brought up to. I was brought up to a very different kind of life from this," she said with a very deep drawn sigh. "It's a weary time I have of it, a weary time." "Are you always on the move, ma'am?" asked the old man. "All the summer time," said the woman. "We get into lodgings for a little time in the winter, and then we let ourselves out to some of the small town theatres, but all the rest of the year we're going from feast to feast and from fair to fair, no rest nor comfort, not a bit." "Poor thing, poor thing," said the old man, and then a choking sensation appeared to have seized him, for he cleared his throat vigorously many times, but seemed unable to say more. The child had climbed on one of the boxes and brought down a square red pincushion from the shelf which ran around the top of the caravan. From this she took two pins and fastened the picture on the wooden walls, so that her mother could see it as she was lying in bed. "It does look pretty there," said the little girl. "Mammy, you can look at it nicely now." "Yes, ma'am," said the old man, as he prepared to take his leave, "and as you look at it, think of that Good Shepherd which is seeking you. He wants to find you, and take you up in his arms and carry you home. And he won't mind the wounds it has cost him, if you'll only let him do it." "Good day, ma'am," said the old man. I shall maybe never see you again, but I would like the Good Shepherd to say those words of you." He went carefully down the steps of the caravan, and Rosalie stood at the window watching him picking his way to the other shows, to which he was carrying the same message of peace. She looked out from between the muslin curtains until he had quite disappeared to a distant part of the field, and then she turned to her mother and said eagerly, "It's a very pretty picture, isn't it, Mammy dear?" But no answer came from the bed. Rosalie thought her mother was asleep, and crept on tiptoe to her side, fearful of waking her. But she found her mother's face buried in the pillow, on which large tears were falling. And when the little girl sat down by her side and tried to comfort her by stroking her hand very gently and saying, Mammy dear, don't cry. What's the matter, Mammy dear?" her mother only wept the more. At length her sobs brought on such a violent fit of coughing that Rosalie was much alarmed, and fetched her a mug of water which was standing on the shelf near the door. By degrees her mother grew calmer, the sobs became less frequent, and to the little girl's joy she fell asleep. Rosalie sat beside her without moving, lest she should awake her, and kept gazing at her picture till she knew every line of it. And the first thing her mother heard when she awoke from sleep was Rosalie's voice saying softly, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 2 The Little Theatre. It was the next evening. The fair was once more in its glory, and crowded with an admiring throng. The great shows were again illuminated, and 3 rows of brilliant stars shone forth from the little theatre belonging to Rosalie's father. He had been out all day, strolling about the town, and had only returned in time to make preparation for the evening's entertainment. "Norah," said her husband, as he put his head in at the door of the caravan, "surely you mean to come and take your part to-night?" "I can't, Augustus, and you would know it if you stayed long enough with me. I've been coughing nearly the whole day." "Well, I wish you would get better soon. It's very awkward to have to fill your part up every time. Conrad has to take it, and every one can see he's not used to it. He's so clumsy and slow." "I'll come as soon as ever I can," said the poor wife with a sigh. "It's to be hoped you will," said her husband. "Women are always fancying they are ill. They lie still thinking about it and nursing themselves up, long after a man would have been at his work again. It's half laziness, that's what it is," said Augustus fiercely. "If you felt as ill as I do, Augustus," said his wife, "I'm sure you wouldn't do any work." "Hold your tongue," said her husband. "I know better than that. Well, mind you have Rosalie ready in time. We shall begin early to-night." Little Rosalie had crept to her mother's side, and was crying quietly at her father's rough words. "Stop crying this minute, child," said Augustus harshly. "Wipe your eyes, you great baby. Do you think you'll be fit to come on the stage if they're red and swollen with crying? Do you hear me? Stop at once, or it will be the worse for you," he shouted as he shut the caravan door. "Rosalie, darling," said her mother, "you mustn't cry. Your father will be so angry, and it's time you got ready. What a noise there is in the fair already," said the poor woman, holding her aching head. Rosalie wiped her eyes and washed her face, and then brought out from one of the boxes the dress in which she was to act at the play. It was a white muslin dress, looped up with pink roses, and there was a wreath of paper roses to wear in her hair. She dressed herself before a tiny looking-glass, and then went to her mother to have the wreath of roses fastened on her head. The poor woman raised herself in bed, and arranged her little girl's long tresses. What a contrast Rosalie looked to the rest of the caravan! The shabby furniture, the thin, wasted mother, the dirty, torn little frock she had just laid aside, were quite out of keeping with the pretty little white-robed figure which stood by the bed. At length her father's voice called her, and after giving her mother a last kiss, and placing some water near her on the box in case a violent fit of coughing should come on, Rosalie ran quickly down the caravan steps and rushed into the brilliantly lighted theatre. A crowd of people stared at her as she flitted past and disappeared up the theatre steps. The audience had not yet been admitted, so Rosalie crept into the room behind the stage, in which her father's company was assembled. They all looked tired and cross, for this was the last night of the fair, and they had had little sleep whilst it lasted. At length Augustus announced that it was time to begin, and they all went out upon a platform which was erected half-way up the outside of the theatre, just underneath the 3 rows of illuminated stars. Here they danced and sang, and shook tambourines in order to beguile the people to enter. Then they disappeared within, and a crowd of eager spectators immediately rushed up the steps, paid their admission money, and took their seats in the theatre. After this the play commenced, Augustus acting as manager, and keeping his company up to their various parts. It was a foolish play, and in some of their parts there was a strong mixture of very objectionable language, yet it was highly appreciated by the audience, and met with vociferous applause. There were many young girls there, some of them servants in respectable families, where they enjoyed every comfort. Yet they looked up at little Rosalie with eyes of admiration and envy. They thought her life was much happier than theirs, and that her lot was greatly to be desired. They looked at the white dress and the pink roses, and contrasted them with their own warm but homely garments. They watched the pretty girl going through her part gracefully and easily, and they contrasted her work with theirs. How interesting! How delightful, they thought, to be doing this instead of scrubbing floors, or washing clothes, or nursing children. But they knew nothing of the life behind the scenes, of the sick mother, the wretched home, the poor and insufficient food, the dirty, ragged frock. They knew nothing of the bitter tears which had just been wiped away, nor of the weary aching of the little feet which were dancing so lightly over the stage. And those little feet became more and more weary as the night went on. As soon as the play was over, the people rushed out into the fair to seek for fresh amusement, but the actors had no rest. Once more they appeared on the platform to attract a fresh audience, and then the same play was repeated, the same songs were sung, the same words were said, fresh to the people who were listening, but oh, how stale and monotonous to the actors themselves. And so it went on all night. As soon as one exhibition was over, another began, and the theatre was filled and refilled long after the clock of the neighbouring church had struck the hour of 12. At last it was over. The last audience had left. The brilliant stars disappeared, and Rosalie was at liberty to creep back to her mother. So weary and exhausted was she that she could hardly drag herself up the caravan steps. She opened the door very gently, that she might not disturb her mother, and then she tried to undress herself, but she was aching in every limb, and sitting down on the box beside her mother's bed, she fell asleep, her little weary head resting on her mother's pillow. Poor little woman! She ought to have been laid in a quiet little nest hours ago, instead of being exposed to the close, hot, stifling air of the theatre through all the long hours of a weary night. In about an hour's time her mother woke, and found her little girl sleeping in her uncomfortable position, her white dress unfastened, and the pink roses from her hair fallen on the ground. Weak as she was, the poor mother dragged herself out of bed to help her tired child to undress. "Rosalie, dear," she said tenderly, "wake up." But for some time Rosalie did not stir, and when her mother touched her she sat up, and said, as if in her sleep, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep, which was lost." "She is dreaming of her picture, poor child," said the mother to herself. Then Rosalie awoke, and shivered as she felt the cold night air on her bare back and arms. Very gently the poor, weak mother helped her to take off her white dress and her small ragged petticoats, and then the child crept into bed and into her mother's arms. "Poor little tired lamb," said the mother, as the weary child nestled up to her. "Am I the lamb?" said Rosalie in a sleepy voice. The mother did not answer, but kissed her child passionately, and then lay awake by her side, weeping and coughing by turns, till the morning dawned. Chapter 3 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 3 The Day After the Fair. The next morning Rosalie was waked by a rap at the caravan door. She crept out of bed, and putting her dress over her shoulders, peeped out between the muslin curtains. "It's Toby, mammy," she said. "I'll see what he wants." She opened the door a crack, and Toby put his mouth to it and whispered, "Miss Rosie, we're going to start in about half an hour. Master has just sent me for the horses. We've been up all night packing. 3 of the wagons is loaded, and they've only some of the scenery to roll up, and then we shall start." "Where are we going, Toby?" asked the child. "It's a town a long way off," said Toby. "We've never been there before, master says, and it will take us nearly a week to get there. But I must be off, Miss Rosie, or master will be coming." "Aren't you tired, Toby?" said the child kindly. Toby shrugged his shoulders and said with a broad grin, "I wonder if anyone in this concern is ever anything else but tired." Then he walked away into the town for the horses, which had been put up in the stables of an inn, and Rosalie returned to her mother. There were several things to be done before they could start. The crockery had all to be taken from the shelf and stowed away in a safe place, lest the jolting over the rough and uneven field should throw it down. Besides this, Rosalie had to dress herself and get her mother's breakfast ready, that she might eat it in peace before the shaking of the caravan commenced. When all was ready, Rosalie stood at the window and looked out. The fair looked very different from what it had done the night before. Most of the show people had been up all night, taking their shows to pieces and packing everything up. Though it was not yet 9 o'clock, many of them had already started, and the field was half empty. It was a dreary scene of desolation. All the little grass it had once possessed, which had given it a right to the name of field, had entirely disappeared, and the bare, uneven ground was thickly strewn with dirty pieces of paper, broken boxes, and old rags which had been left behind by the show people, besides a quantity of orange peel and cocoanut and oyster shells which had been thrown into the mud the night before. Very dirty and untidy and forlorn it looked, as Rosalie gazed at it from the door of the caravan. Then a wagon jolted past, laden with the largest of the numerous whirligigs, the wooden horses and elephants peeping out from the waterproof covering which had been thrown over them. Then a large swing passed by, then the show of the giant and dwarf. These were followed by a pea boiling establishment and the marionettes. And a few minutes afterwards the show of the blue horse and the performing seal set out on its way to the next feast, accompanied by the shows of the fat boy and of the lady without arms, who performed wonders with her toes in the ways of tea-making and other household business, and whose very infirmities and deformities were thus made into gain and exposed to the gaze of curious crowds by her own relations. All these rattled past, and Rosalie watched them out of sight. Then Toby returned with the horses. They were yoked to the wagons and to the caravans, and the little cavalcade set forth. The jolting over the rough ground was very great, and much tried the poor sick woman, who was shaken from side to side of her wretched bed. Then outside the field they had to wait a long time, for the road was completely filled by the numerous caravans of the wild beast show, and no one could pass until they were gone. The elephants were standing close to the pavement, now and again twisting their long trunks into the trees of the small gardens in front of the neighbouring houses, and they would undoubtedly have broken the branches to atoms had not their keeper driven them off with his whip. A crowd of children was gathered round them, feeding them with bread and biscuit, and enjoying the delay of the show. But Augustus became very impatient, for he had a long journey before him, so after pacing up and down and chafing against the stoppage for some time, he went up to the manager of the wild beast show and addressed him in such violent and passionate language that a policeman was obliged to interfere and desired him to keep the peace. At length the huge yellow caravans, each drawn by 6 strong cart horses, moved slowly on, led by a procession of elephants and camels, and followed by a large crowd of children who accompanied them to the outskirts of the town. Here, by turning down a by-street, the theatre party was able to pass them, and thus get the start of them on their journey. Rosalie was glad to leave the town, and feel the fresh country air blowing upon her face. It was so very refreshing after the close, stagnant air of the fair. She opened the upper part of the door and stood looking out, watching Toby, who was driving, and talking to him from time to time of the objects which they passed by the way. It was a new road to Rosalie and to her mother. At length, about 12 o'clock, they came to a little village, where they halted for a short time, that the horses might rest before going farther. The country children were just leaving the village school, and they gathered round the caravans with open eyes and mouths, staring curiously at the smoke coming from the small chimneys, and at Rosalie, who was peeping out from between the muslin curtains. But, after satisfying their curiosity, they moved away in little groups to their various homes, that they might be in time to get their dinner done before afternoon school. Then the village street was quite quiet, and Rosalie stood at the door watching the birds hopping from tree to tree, and the bees gathering honey from the flowers in the gardens. Her mother was better to-day, and was dressing herself slowly, for she thought that a breath of country air might revive and strengthen her. Augustus, Toby, and the other men of the company had gone into the small inn for refreshment, and Toby was sent back to the caravan with large slices of bread and cheese for Rosalie and her mother. The child ate of it eagerly. The fresh air had given her an appetite, but the poor woman could not touch it. As soon as she was dressed, she crept, with Rosalie's help, to the door of the caravan, and sat on the top step, leaning against one of the boxes, which the child dragged from its place to make a support for her. The caravan was drawn up by the side of a small cottage with a thatched roof. There was a little garden in front of it, filled with sweet flowers, large cabbage roses, southernwood, rosemary, sweetbriar, and lavender. As the wind blew softly over them, it wafted their sweet fragrance to the sick woman sitting on the caravan steps. The quiet stillness of the country was very refreshing and soothing to her after the turmoil and din of the last week. No sound was to be heard but the singing of the larks overhead, the humming of the bees, and the gentle rustling of the breeze amongst the branches. Then the cottage door opened, and a little child, about 3 years old, ran out with a ball in his hand, which he rolled down the path leading to the garden gate. A minute afterwards, a young woman in a clean cotton gown and white apron brought her work outside, and sitting on the seat near the cottage door, watched her child at play with a mother's love and tenderness. She was knitting a little red sock for one of those tiny feet to wear. Click, click, click went her knitting needles, but she kept her eyes on the child, ready to run to him at the first alarm, to pick him up if he should fall, or to soothe him if he should be in trouble. Now and then she glanced at the caravan standing at her garden gate, and gave a look of compassion at the poor thin woman, whose cough from time to time was so distressing. Then, as was her custom, she began to sing as she worked. She had a clear, sweet voice, and the sick woman and her child listened. The words of her song were these: Jesus, I thy face am seeking, early will I turn to thee. Words of love thy voice is speaking, come, come to me. Come to me when life is dawning, I thy dearest friend would be. In the sunshine of the morning, come, come to me. Come to me, oh do believe me, I have shed my blood for thee, I am waiting to receive thee. Come, come to me. Lord, I come without delaying, to thine arms at once I flee, lest no more I hear thee saying, come, come to me. When she had finished singing, all was quite still again. There was hardly a sound except the pattering of the little feet on the garden path. But presently the child began to cry, and the careful mother flew to his side to discover what had pained him. It was only the loss of his ball, which he had thrown too high, and which had gone over the hedge, and seemed to him lost forever. Only his ball, and yet that ball was as much to that tiny mind as our most precious treasures are to us. The mother knew this, so she calmed the child's fears, and ran immediately to recover his lost plaything. But Rosalie was before her. She had seen the ball come over the hedge, and had heard the child's cry, and when his mother appeared at the gate, she saw the child of the caravan returning from her chase after the ball, which had rolled some way down the hilly road. She brought it to the young mother, who thanked her for her kindness, and then gazed lovingly and pityingly into her face. She was a mother, and she thought of the happy life her child led, compared with that of this poor little wanderer. With this feeling in her heart, after restoring the ball to the once more contented child, she ran into the house and returned with a mug of new milk, and a slice of bread, spread with fresh country butter, which she handed to Rosalie and begged her to eat. "Thank you, ma'am," said little Rosalie, "but please may Mammy have it? I've had some bread and cheese, but she is too ill to eat that, and this would do her such good." "Yes, to be sure," said the kind-hearted countrywoman. "Give her that, child, and I'll fetch some more for you." And so it came to pass that Rosalie and her mother had quite a little picnic on the steps of the caravan, with the young woman standing by and talking to them as they ate, and now and then looking over the hedge into the garden, that she might see if any trouble had come to her boy. "I liked to hear you sing," said Rosalie's mother. "Did you?" said the young woman. "I often sing when I'm knitting. My little one likes to hear me, and he almost knows that hymn now. Often when he is at play, I hear him singing, 'Tum, tum to me,' so prettily, the little dear," she said with tears in her eyes. "I wish I knew it," said Rosalie. "I'll tell you what," said the young woman, "I'll give you a card with it on. Our clergyman had it printed, and we've got 2 of them." She ran again into the house, and returned with a card, on which the hymn was printed in clear, distinct type. There were 2 holes pierced through the top of the card, and a piece of blue ribbon had been slipped through, and tied in a bow at the top. Rosalie seized it eagerly, and began reading it at once. "We've got such a good clergyman here," said the young woman. "He has not been here more than a few months, and he has done so much nice things for us. Mrs. Leslie reads aloud in one of the cottages once a week, and we all take our work and go to listen to her, and she talks to us so beautifully out of the Bible. It always does me good to go." She stopped suddenly as she saw Rosalie's mother's face. She had turned deadly pale, and was leaning back against the box with her eyes fixed upon her. "What's the matter, ma'am?" said the kind-hearted little woman. "I'm afraid you've turned faint, and how you do tremble! Let me help you in. You'd better lie on your bed, hadn't you?" She gave her her arm, and she and Rosalie took her inside the caravan and laid her on her bed. But she was obliged to leave her in a minute or two, as her little boy was climbing on the gate, and she was afraid he would fall. A few minutes afterwards a great noise was heard in the distance, and a number of the village children appeared, running in front of the wild beast show, which was just passing through. The young woman took her little boy in her arms and held him up, that he might see the elephants and camels, which were marching with stately dignity in front of the yellow vans. When they had gone, Toby appeared with the horse, and said his master had told him he was to start, and he would follow presently with the rest of the wagons. The horse was soon put in the caravan, and they were just starting, when the young woman gathered a nosegay of the lovely flowers in her garden, and handed them to Rosalie, saying, "Take them and put them in water for your mother. The sight of them maybe will do her good. You'll learn the hymn, won't you? Good bye, and God bless you." She watched them out of sight, standing at her cottage door with her child in her arms, whilst Rosalie leaned out of the window to nod to her and smile at her. Then they turned a corner and came into the main street of the village. "Can you see the church, Rosalie?" asked her mother hurriedly. "Yes, Mammy dear," said Rosalie. "It's just at the end of this street. Such a pretty church, with trees all around it." "Are there any houses near it?" asked her mother. "Only one, Mammy dear, a big house in a garden, but I can't see it very well, there are so many trees in front of it." "Ask Toby to put you down, Rosalie, and run and have a look at it as we pass." So Rosalie was lifted down from the caravan and ran up to the vicarage gate, whilst her mother raised herself on her elbow to see as much as she could through the open window, but she could only see the spire of the church and the chimneys of the house, and she was too exhausted to get up. Presently Rosalie overtook them, panting with her running. Toby never dared to wait for her, lest his master should find fault with him for stopping. But Rosalie often got down from the caravan to gather wild flowers or to drink at a wayside spring, and as she was very fleet of foot, she was always able to overtake them. "What was it like, Rosalie?" asked her mother, when she was seated on the box beside her bed. "Oh, ever so pretty, Mammy dear, such soft grass and such lovely roses, and a broad gravel walk all up to the door, and in the garden there was a lady, such a pretty, kind-looking lady, and she and her little girl were gathering some of the flowers." "Did they see you, Rosalie?" "Yes, the little girl saw me, Mammy, peeping through the gate, and she said, 'Who is that little girl, mamma? I never saw her before.' And then her mamma looked up and smiled at me, and she was just coming to speak to me when I turned, frightened, and I saw the caravan had gone out of sight. So I ran away, and I've been running ever since to get up to you." The mother listened to her child's account with a pale and restless face. Then she lay back on her pillow and sighed several times. At last they heard a rumbling sound behind them, and Toby announced, "It's master, he's soon overtaken us." "Rosalie," said her mother anxiously, "don't tell your father about that house, or that I told you to go and look at it, or about what that young woman said. Mind you never say a word to him about it. Promise me, Rosalie." "Why not, Mammy dear?" asked Rosalie, with a very perplexed face. "Never mind, Rosalie," said her mother fretfully. "I don't wish it." "Very well, Mammy dear," said Rosalie. "I'll tell you some time, Rosalie," said her mother gently, a minute or two afterwards. "Not to day, though. Oh, no, I can't tell it to day." Rosalie wondered very much what her mother meant, and she sat watching her pale, sorrowful face as she lay on her bed with her eyes closed. What was she thinking of? What was it she had to tell her? For some time Rosalie sat quite still, musing on what her mother had said, and then she pinned the card on the wall just over her dear picture, and once more read the words of the hymn. After this she arranged the flowers in a small glass and put them on the box near her mother's bed. The sweet briar and cabbage roses and southernwood filled the caravan with their fragrance. Then Rosalie took up her usual position at the door, to watch Toby driving, and to see all that was to be seen by the way. They passed through several other villages, and saw many lone farmhouses and solitary cottages. When night came, they drew up on the outskirts of a small market town. Toby took the horses to an inn, and they rested there for the night. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 4 The Actress's Story. The next morning, as soon as it was light, the horses were put in again, and the theatre party proceeded on their way. Rosalie's mother seemed much better, The country air and country quiet had, for a time, restored to her much of her former strength. She was able, with Rosalie's help, to dress herself, and to sit on one of the boxes beside her bed, resting her head against the pillows and gazing out on the green fields and clear blue sky. The sweet, fresh breezes came in at the open door and fanned her careworn face and the face of the child who sat beside her. "Rosalie," said her mother suddenly, "would you like to hear about the time when your mother was a little girl?" "Yes, mammy dear," said Rosalie, nestling up to her side. "I know nothing at all about it." "No, Rosalie," said her mother, "it's the beginning of a very sad story, and I did not like my little girl to know about it. But I sometimes think I shan't be long with you, and I had rather tell it to you myself than have any one else tell it. And you're getting a great girl now, Rosalie. You will be able to understand many things you could not have understood before, and there have been things the last few days which have brought it all back to me, and made me think of it by day and dream of it by night." "Please tell me, mammy dear," said Rosalie, as her mother stopped talking. "Would you like to hear it now?" said the poor woman, with a sigh, as if she hardly liked to begin. "Please, mammy dear," said Rosalie. "Then draw closer to me, child, for I don't want Toby to hear. And mind, you must never speak of what I am going to tell you before your father. Never! Promise me, Rosalie," she said earnestly. "No, never, mammy dear," said little Rosalie. Then there was a silence for a minute or two afterwards, no sound to be heard but the cracking of Toby's whip and the rumbling of the wagons behind. "Aren't you going to begin, mammy?" said Rosalie at length. "I almost wish I hadn't promised to tell you, child," said her mother hurriedly. "It cuts me up so to think of it. But never mind, you ought to know, and you will know some day, so I had better tell you myself. Rosalie, your mother was born a lady." "Yes," said the poor woman, as the child did not speak. "I was never born to this misery of life. I brought myself to it. I chose it," she said bitterly, "and I'm only getting the harvest of what I sowed myself." When she had said this, she turned deadly pale and shivered from head to foot. Rosalie crept still closer to her and put her little warm hand in her mother's cold one. Then the poor woman by a strong effort controlled herself, and she went on. "So now, darling, I'll tell you all about it, just as if I was talking about some one else. I'll forget it is myself, or I shall never be able to tell it. I'll try and fancy I'm on the stage, talking about the sorrows and troubles of some one I never knew and never cared for, and of whom I shall never think again when my part is over. I was born in a country village, hundreds of miles from here, in the south of England. My father was the squire of the place. We lived in a large mansion, which was built half-way up the side of a wooded hill, and an avenue of beautiful old trees led up to the house. There was a large conservatory at one side of it, filled with the rarest flowers, and in a shady corner of the grounds my mother had a kind of grotto filled with lovely ferns, through which a clear stream of water was ever flowing. This fernery was my mother's great delight, and here she spent much of her time. She was a very worldly woman. She took very little notice of her children, and when she was not in the garden she was generally lying on the sofa in the drawing-room, reading novels which she procured from a London library. My father was a very different man. He was fond of quiet, and fond of his children, but he was obliged to be often from home, so that we did not see as much of him as we should otherwise have done. I had one brother and one sister. My brother was much older than we were. There had been several children between us who had died in their infancy, so that he was in the sixth form of a large public school, whilst we were children in the nursery. My sister Lucy was a year younger than I was. She was such a pretty child, and had a very sweet disposition. When we were children we got on very well together, and shared every pleasure and every grief. My father bought us a little white pony, and on this we used to ride in turns about the park when we were quite small children, our old nurse following to see that no harm came to us. She was a very good old woman. She taught us to say our prayers night and morning, and on Sundays she used to sit with us under a tree in the park, and show us scripture pictures and tell us stories out of the Bible. There was one picture of a shepherd, very like that, Rosalie. It came back to my mind the other day when that old man gave it to you. Only in mine, the shepherd was just drawing the lamb out of a deep miry pit into which it had fallen, and the text underneath it was this: 'The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost.' We used to learn these texts and repeat them to our nurse when we looked at the pictures, and then if we had said them correctly she used to let us carry our tea into the park and eat it under the tree. And after tea we used to sing one of our little hymns and say our prayers, and then she took us in and put us to bed. I have often thought of those quiet, happy Sundays when I have been listening to the noise and racket of the fair. I thought a great deal at the time about what our nurse told us. I remember one Sunday she had been reading to us about the Judgment Day, and how God would read out of a book all the wrong things we had done. And that same afternoon there was a great thunderstorm. The lightning flashed in at the window and the thunder rolled overhead. It made me think of what nurse had said and of the Judgment Day, and then I knelt down and prayed that God would take care of me and not let the lightning kill me. I crept behind the sofa in the drawing room and trembled lest the books should be opened and all my sins read out, and I asked God to keep them shut a little longer. And I remember another day when I had told a lie, but would not own that I had done so. Nurse would not let me sleep with Lucy, but moved my little bed into her room, that I might lie still and think about my sin. It was a strange room, and I could not sleep for some time, but I lay awake with my eyes closed. When I opened them, I saw one bright star shining in at the closed window. It seemed to me like the eye of God watching me. I could not get the thought out of my mind. I shut my eyes tightly, that I might not see it, but I could not help opening them to see if it was still there, and when the nurse came up to bed, she found me weeping. I have often seen that star since, Rosalie, looking in at the window of the caravan, and it always reminds me of that night, and makes me think of that eye. I had a very strong will, Rosalie, and even as a child I hated to be controlled. If I set my heart upon anything, I wanted to have it at once, and if I was opposed, I was very angry. I loved my dear old nurse, but when we were about 8 years old, she had to leave us to live with her mother, and then I was completely unmanageable. My mother engaged a governess for us, who was to teach us in a morning and take us out in the afternoon. She was an indolent person, and she took very little trouble with us, and my mother did not exert herself sufficiently to look after us, or to see what we were doing. Thus we learnt very little, and got into idle and careless habits. Our governess used to sit down in the park with a book, and we were allowed to follow our own devices and amuse ourselves as we pleased. When my brother Gerald came home, it was always a great cause of excitement to us. We used to meet him at the station, and drive him home in triumph. Then we always had holidays, and Miss Manders went away, and Gerald used to amuse us with stories of his school friends as we walked with him through the park. He was a very fine-looking lad, and my mother was very proud of him. She thought much more of him than of us, because he was a boy, and was to be the heir to the property. She liked to drive out with her handsome son, who was admired by every one who saw him, and sometimes we were allowed to go with them. We were generally left outside in the carriage, whilst mamma and Gerald called at the large houses of the neighbourhood, and we used to jump out as soon as they had disappeared inside the house, and explore the different gardens, and plan how we would lay out our grounds when we had houses of our own. But what's that, Rosalie? Did the wagon stop?" Rosalie ran to the door and looked out. "Yes, mammy," she said, "my father's coming." "Then mind not a word," said her mother in a hoarse whisper. "Well," said Augustus, entering the caravan in a theatrical manner, "I thought I might as well enjoy the felicity of the amiable society of my lady and her daughter." This was said with a profound bow towards his wife and Rosalie. "Glad to see you so much better, madam," he continued. "Rather singular, isn't it, that your health and spirits have revived immediately we have left the inspired scene of the public action, or, to speak in plain terms, when there's no work to do." "I think it's the fresh air, Augustus, that has done me good. There was such a close, stifling smell from the fair, I felt worse directly we got there." "It is to be hoped," he said with a disagreeable smile on his face, that this resuscitation of the vital powers may be continued until we arrive at Lesborough, but the probability is that the moment we arrive on the scene of action you will be seized with that most unpleasant of all maladies, distaste to your work, and will be compelled once more to resume that most interesting and pathetic occupation of playing the invalid." "Oh, Augustus, don't speak to me like that," said the poor wife. Augustus made no answer, but taking a piece of paper from his pocket, twisted it up, and putting it into the fire, lighted a long pipe, and began to smoke. The fumes of the tobacco brought on his poor wife's cough, but he took very little notice of her, except to ask her occasionally, between the whiffs of his pipe, how long that melodious sound was to last. Then his eyes fell upon Rosalie's picture, which was pinned to the side of the caravan. "Where did you get that from?" he inquired, turning to his wife. "It's mine, father," said little Rosalie. "An old gentleman in the fair gave it to me. Isn't it pretty?" "It will do for a child," he said scornfully. "Toby, what are you after? You're creeping along. We shall never get there at this pace." "The horse is tired, master," said Toby. "He's had a long stretch these 2 days." "Beat him then," said the cruel man. "Flog him well. Do you think I can afford to waste time upon the road? The wild beasts are a mile ahead at the very least, and the marionettes will be there by this time. We shall just arrive when all the people have spent their money and are tired out." Now there was one subject of standing dispute between Toby and his master. Toby was a kind-hearted lad, and hated to see the horses overworked, ill-fed, and badly used. He was always remonstrating with his master about it, and thereby bringing down upon himself his master's wrath and abuse. Augustus cared nothing for the comfort or welfare of those under him. To get as much work as possible out of them, and to make as much gain by them as he could, was all he thought of. They might be tired, or hungry, or overburdened. What did it matter to him, so long as at the end for which he kept them was fulfilled? The same spirit which led him to treat his company and his wife with severity and indifference, led him to ill-treat his horses. Toby resolutely refused to beat the poor tired horse, which was already straining itself to its utmost, the additional weight of Augustus having been very trying to it the last few miles. When Augustus saw that Toby did not mean to obey him, he sprang to the door of the caravan in a towering passion, seized the whip from Toby's hand, and then beat the poor horse unmercifully, causing it to start from side to side, till nearly everything in the caravan was thrown to the ground, and Rosalie and her mother trembled with suppressed indignation and horror. Then, with one last tremendous blow, aimed at Toby's head, Augustus threw down the whip and returned to his pipe. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 5. Rosalie's First Sermon. The next morning, as soon as they had started on their journey, Rosalie begged her mother to continue her story. So, after satisfying herself that her husband did not intend to favour them with his company, the poor woman took up the thread of her story at the place at which she had left it when they were interrupted the day before. "I was telling you, dear, about my life in that quiet country manor house. I think I can remember nothing worth mentioning until an event happened which altered the whole course of our lives. Lucy and I had been out riding in the park on the beautiful horses which our father had given us a few months before, and we had had a very pleasant afternoon. I can see Lucy now in her riding habit, her fair hair hanging down her back, and her cheeks glowing with the air and exercise. She was very pretty, was my sister Lucy. People said I was handsomer than she was, and had a better figure and brighter eyes, but Lucy was a sweet-looking little thing, and no one could look at her without loving her. We got down from our horses, leaving them with the groom who had been riding out with us, and ran into the house. But we were met by one of the servants, with a face white with alarm, who begged us to go quietly upstairs, as our father was very ill, and the doctor said he was to be perfectly quiet. We asked her what was the matter with him, and she told us that he had been riding home from the railway station. His horse, which was a young one he had just bought, had thrown him, and that he had been brought home insensible. More than this she could not tell us, but our mother came into our bedroom and told us, with more feeling than I had ever seen in her face before, that our father could not live through the night. I shall never forget that night. It was the first night that I had been brought close to death, and it frightened me. I lay awake listening to the hall clock as it struck 1 hour after another. Then I crept out of bed and put my head out of the window. It was a close, oppressive night. Not a breath seemed to be stirring. I wondered what was going on in the next room, and whether I should ever see my father again. Then I thought I heard a sound, but it was only Lucy sobbing beneath the bedclothes. "Lucy," I said, glad to find she was awake, "isn't it a long night?" "Yes, Norah," she answered. "I'm so frightened. Shall we have a light?" I found the matches and lighted a candle, but 3 or 4 large moths darted into the room, so that I had to close the window. We lay awake in our little beds, watching the moths darting in and out of the candle and straining our ears for any sound from our father's room. Each time a door shut we started and sat up in bed listening. "Wouldn't you be frightened if you were dying, Norah?" said Lucy under her breath. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure I should." Then there was silence again for a long time, and I thought Lucy had fallen asleep, when she got up in bed and spoke again. "Norah, do you think you would go to heaven if you were to die?" "Yes, of course," I said quickly. "Why do you ask me?" "But I don't think I should," said Lucy. "I'm almost sure I shouldn't." We lay still for about another hour, and then the door opened, and our mother came in. She was crying very much, and had a handkerchief to her eyes. "Your father wants to see you," she said. "Come at once." We crept very quietly into the room of death, and stood beside our father's bed. His face was so altered that it frightened us, and we trembled from head to foot. But he held out his hand to us, Rosalie, and we drew closer to him. Then he whispered, "Good-bye. Don't forget your father, and don't wait till you come to die to get ready for another world." Then we kissed him, and our mother told us to go back to bed. I never forgot my father's last words to us, and I often wondered what made him say them. The next morning we heard that our father was dead. Gerald arrived too late to see him. He was at college then, and was just preparing for his last examination. My mother seemed at first very much distressed by my father's death. She shut herself up in her room and would see no one. The funeral was a very grand one. All the people of the neighbourhood came to it, and Lucy and I peeped out of one of the top windows to see it start. After it was over, Gerald went back to college, and my mother returned to her novels. I think she thought, Rosalie, that she would be able to return to her old life, much as before, but no sooner had Gerald passed his last examination than she received a letter from him to say that he intended to be married in a few months, and to bring his bride to the Hall. Then for the first time the truth flashed upon my mother's mind, that she would soon be no longer the mistress of the manor house, but would have to seek a home elsewhere. She seemed at first very angry with Gerald for marrying so early, but she could say nothing against his choice, for she was a young lady of title, and one in every way suited to the position she was to occupy. My mother at length decided to remove to a town in the Midland countries, where she would have some good society and plenty of gaiety so soon as her mourning for my father was ended. It was a great trial to us, leaving the old home. Lucy and I went around the park the day before we left, gathering leaves from our favourite trees, and taking a last look at the home of our childhood. Then we walked through the house, and looked out of the window on the lovely wooded hills, with eyes which were full of tears. I have never seen it since, and I shall never see it again. Sometimes when we are coming through the country, it brings it back to my mind, and I could almost fancy I was walking down one of the long grassy terraces, or wandering in the quiet shade of the trees in the park. Hush! What was that, Rosalie? said her mother, leaning forward to listen. "Was it music?" At first Rosalie could hear nothing except Toby whistling to his horse, and the rumbling of the wheels of the caravan. She went to the door and leaned out and listened once more. The sun was beginning to set, for Rosalie's mother had only been able to talk at intervals during the day, from her frequent fits of coughing, and from numerous other interruptions, such as the preparations for dinner, the halting to give the horses rest, and the occasional visits of Augustus. The rosy clouds were gathering in the west, as the pure evening breeze wafted to the little girl's ears the distant sound of bells. "It's bells, Mammy," she said, turning around. "Church bells. Can't you hear them? Ding dong bell, ding dong bell." "Yes," said her mother, "I can hear them clearly now. Our old nurse used to tell us they were saying, 'Come and pray, come and pray.' Oh, Rosalie, it is such a comfort to be able to speak of those days to some one. I've kept it all hidden up in my heart till sometimes I have felt as if it would burst." "I can see the church now, Mammy," said Rosalie. "It's a pretty little gray church with a tower. And we're going through the village, aren't we, Toby?" "Yes, Miss Rosie," said Toby. "We're going to stop here all night. The horses are tired out, and it's so fair to see that even master can see it now. We shall get on all the quicker for giving them a bit of rest." "Can't you hear the bells nicely now, Mammy?" said Rosalie, turning round. "Yes," said the poor woman, "they sound just like the bells of our little church at home. I could almost cry when I hear them." By this time they had reached the village. It was growing dark, and the country people were lighting their candles and gathering round their small fires. Rosalie could see inside many a cheerful little home where the firelight was shining on the faces of the father, the mother, and the children. How she wished they had a little home! Ding dong bell, ding dong bell. Still the chimes went on, and one and another came out of the small cottages and took the road leading to the church with their books under their arms. Toby drove on. Nearer and nearer the chimes sounded, until at last, just as the caravan reached a wide open common in front of the church, they ceased, and Rosalie saw the last old woman entering the church door before the service began. The wagons and caravans were drawn up on this open space for the night. Toby and the other men led the horses away to the stables of the inn. Augustus followed them, to enjoy himself amongst the lively company assembled in the little coffee-room, and Rosalie and her mother were left alone. "Mammy dear," said Rosalie, as soon as the men had turned the corner, "may I go and peep at the church?" "Yes, child," said her mother, "only don't make a noise if the people are inside." Rosalie did not wait for a second permission, but darted across the common and opened the church gate. It was getting dark now, and the gravestones looked very solemn in the twilight. She went quickly past them, and crept along the side of the church to one of the windows. She could see inside the church quite well, because it was lighted up, but no one could see her as she was standing in the dark churchyard. Her bright, quick eyes soon took in all that was to be seen. The minister was kneeling down, and so were all the people. There were a good many there, though the church was not full, as it was the week evening service. Rosalie watched at the window until all the people got up from their knees, when the clergyman gave out a hymn, and they began to sing. Rosalie then looked for the door, that she might hear the music better. It was a warm evening, and the door was open, and before she knew what she was about, she had crept inside and was sitting on a low seat just within. No one noticed her, for they were all looking in the opposite direction. Rosalie enjoyed the singing very much, and when it was over the clergyman began to speak. He had a clear, distinct voice, and he spoke in simple language which everyone could understand. Rosalie listened with all her might. It was the first sermon she had ever heard. "The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost." That was the text of Rosalie's first sermon. As soon as the service was over, she stole out of the church and crept down the dark churchyard. She had passed through the little gate, and was crossing the common to the caravan before the first person had left the church. To Rosalie's joy, her father had not returned, for he had found the society in the village inn extremely attractive. Rosalie's mother looked up as the child came in. "Where have you been all this time, Rosalie?" Rosalie gave an account of all she had seen, and told her how she had crept in at the open door of the church. "And what did the clergyman say, child?" asked her mother. "He said your text, mammy, the text that was on your picture. The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost." "And what did he tell you about it?" "He said Jesus went up and down all over to look for lost sheep, mammy, and he said we were all the sheep, and Jesus was looking for us. Do you think he is looking for you and me, mammy dear?" "I don't know, child. I suppose so," said her mother. "I shall take a good deal of looking for, I'm afraid." "But he said, mammy, that if only we would let him find us, he would be sure to do it. He doesn't mind how much trouble he takes about it." Rosalie's mother was quite still for some time after this. Rosalie stood at the caravan door, watching the bright stars coming out one by one in the still sky. "Mammy dear," she said, "is he up there?" "Who, Rosalie child?" said her mother. "The Saviour. Is he up in one of the stairs?" "Yes. Heaven's somewhere there, Rosalie, up above the sky somewhere." "Would it be any good telling him, mammy?" "Telling him what, my dear?" "Just telling him that you and me want seeking and finding." "I don't know, Rosalie. You can try," said her mother sadly. "Please, Good Shepherd," said Rosalie, looking up at the stars, "come and seek me and mammy, and find us very quick, and carry us very safe, like the lamb in the picture." "Will that do, mammy?" said Rosalie. "Yes," said her mother, "I suppose so." Then Rosalie was still again, looking at the stars. But a sudden thought seized her. "Mammy, ought I to have said Amen?" "Why, Rosalie?" "I heard the people at church say it. Will it do any good without Amen?" "Oh, I don't think it matters much," said her mother. "You can say it now, if you like." "Amen, amen," said Rosalie, looking at the stars again. But just then voices were heard in the distance, and Rosalie saw her father and the men crossing the dark common and coming in the direction of the caravan. Chapter 6 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 6 A Family Secret. How sweet and calm the village looked the next morning, when Rosalie woke and looked out at it. She was quite sorry to leave it, but there was no rest for these poor wanderers. They must move onwards, towards the town where they were next to perform. And as they travelled on, Rosalie's mother went on with her sad story. "I told you, darling, that my mother took a house in town, and that we all moved there, that my brother Gerald might take possession of our old home. We were getting great girls now, and my mother sent Miss Manders away and left us to our own devices. My sister Lucy had been very different since our father died. She was so quiet and still that I often wondered what was the matter with her. She spent nearly all her time reading her Bible in a little attic chamber. I did not know why she went there, till one day I went upstairs to get something out of a box, and found Lucy sitting in the window seat reading her little black Bible. I asked her what she read it for, and she said, 'Oh, Norah, it makes me so happy. Won't you come and read it with me?' But I tossed my head, and said I had too much to do to waste any time like that, and I ran downstairs and tried to forget what I had seen, for I knew that my sister was right and I was wrong. Oh, Rosalie, darling, I've often thought, if I had listened to my sister Lucy that day, what a different life I might have led. Well, I must go on. I'm coming to the saddest part of my story, and I had better get over it as quickly as I can. As I got older I took to reading novels. Our house was full of them, for my mother spent her days in devouring them. I read them and read them till I lived in them, and was never happy unless I was fancying myself one of the heroines of whom I read. My life seemed dull and monotonous. I wanted to see more of the world and to have something romantic happen to me. Oh, Rosalie, I got so restless and discontented. I used to wake in the night and wonder what my fortunes would be, and then I used to light the candle and go on with the exciting novel I had been reading the night before. Often I used to read half the night, for I could not sleep again till I knew the end of the story. I quite left off saying my prayers, for I could not think of anything of that sort when I was in the middle of a novel. It was just about this time that I became acquainted with a family of the name of Roe-Hunter. They were rich people, friends of my mother. Miss Georgina and Miss Laura Roe-Hunter were very fast, dashing girls. They took a great fancy to me, and we were always together. They were passionately fond of the theatre, and they took me to it night after night. I could think of nothing else, Rosalie. I dreamt of it every night. It took even more hold of me than the novels had done, for it seemed to me like a living novel. I admired the scenery, I admired the actors, I admired everything that I saw. I thought if I was only on the stage I should be perfectly happy. There was nothing in the world that I wanted so much. It seemed to me such a free, happy, romantic life. When an actress was greeted with bursts of applause, I almost envied her. How wearisome my life seemed when compared with hers! I kept a book then, Rosalie darling, in which I wrote all that I did every day, and I used to write again and again, "No change yet, my life wants variety. It is the same over and over again." I determined that as soon as possible I would have a change, cost what it might. Soon after this the Roe-Hunters told me that they were going to have some private theatricals, and that I must come and help them. It was just what I wanted. Now, I thought, I could fancy myself an actress. They engaged some of the professional actors at the theatre to teach us our parts, to arrange the scenery, and to help us do everything in the best possible manner. I had to go up to the Roe-Hunters again and again to learn my part of the performance, and there it was, Rosalie dear, that I met your father. He was one of the actors whom they employed. You can guess what came next, my darling. Your father saw how well I could act, and how passionately fond I was of it, and by degrees he found out how much I should like to do it always, instead of leading my humdrum life at home. So he used to meet me in the street and talk to me about it, and he told me that if I would only come with him, I should have a life of pleasure and excitement, and never know what care was. And he arranged that the day after these private theatricals we should run away and be married. Oh, darling, I shall never forget that day. I arrived home late at night, or rather early in the morning, worn out with the evening's entertainment. I had been much praised for the way I had performed my part, and some of the company had declared I should make a first-rate actress, and I thought to myself that they little knew how soon I was to become one. As I drove home, I felt in a perfect whirl of excitement. The day had come at last. Was I glad? I hardly knew. I tried to think I was, but somehow I felt sick at heart. I could not shake that feeling off, and as I walked upstairs I felt perfectly miserable. My mother had gone to bed, and I never saw her again. Lucy was fast asleep, lying with her hand under her cheek, sleeping peacefully. I stood a minute or two looking at her. Her little Bible was lying beside her, for she had been reading it the last thing before she went to sleep. Oh, Rosalie, I would have given anything to change places with Lucy then. But it was too late now. Augustus was to meet me outside the house, and we were to be married at a church in the town that very morning. Our names had been posted up in the register office some weeks before. I turned away from Lucy, and began putting some things together to take with me, and I hid them under the bed lest Lucy should wake and see them. It was no use going to bed, for I had not got home from the theatricals till 3 o'clock, and in 2 hours Augustus would come. So I scribbled a little note to my mother, telling her that when she received it I should be married, and that I would call and see her in a few days. Then I put out the light, lest it should wake my sister, and sat waiting in the dark. And, Rosie dear, that star, the same star that I had seen that night when I was a little girl, and had told that lie, that same star came and looked in at the window, and again it seemed to me like the eye of God. I felt so frightened that once I thought I would not go. I almost determined to write Augustus a note, giving it up, but I thought that he would laugh at me for being such a coward, and I tried to picture to myself once more how fine it would be to be a real actress, and be always praised as I had been last night. Then I got up and drew down the blind that I might hide the star from sight. I was so glad to see it beginning to get light, for I knew that the star would fade away, and that Augustus would soon come. At last the church clock struck 5, so I took my carpet-bag from under the bed, wrapped myself up in a warm shawl, and leaving my note on the dressing-table prepared to go downstairs. But I turned back when I got to the door to look once more at my sister Lucy. And Rosalie, darling, as I looked, I felt as if my tears would choke me. I wiped them hastily away, however, and crept downstairs. Every creaking board made me jump and tremble lest I should be discovered, and at every turning I expected to see some one watching me. But no one appeared. I got down safely, and cautiously unbolting the hall door, I stole quietly out into the street, and soon found Augustus, who carried my bag under his arm, and that morning we were married. And then my troubles began. It was not half as pleasant being an actress as I had thought it would be. I knew nothing of the life behind the scenes. I did not know how tired I should be, nor what a comfortless life I should lead. Oh, Rosalie, I was soon sick of it. I would have given worlds to be back in my old home. I would have given worlds to lead that quiet, peaceful life again. I was much praised and applauded in the theatre, but after a time I cared very little for it, and as for the acting itself, I became thoroughly sick of it. Oh, Rosalie dear, I have often and often fallen asleep, unable to undress myself from weariness, after acting in the play, and again I have wished that I had never seen the inside of a theatre, and never known anything of the wretched life of an actress. We stopped for some time in the town where my mother lived, for Augustus had an engagement in a theatre there, and he procured one for me. We had miserable lodgings, and often were very badly off. I called at home a few days after I was married, but the servant shut the door in my face, saying that my mother never wished to see me again, or to hear my name mentioned. I used to walk up and down outside, trying to catch a glimpse of my sister Lucy, but she was never allowed to go out alone, and I could not get an opportunity of speaking to her. All my old friends passed me in the street. Even the row hunters would take no notice of me whatever. And then your father lost his engagement at the theatre. I need not tell you why, Rosalie darling. And we left the town, and then I began to know what poverty meant. We travelled from place to place, sometimes getting occasional jobs at small-town theatres, sometimes stopping at a town for a few months and then being dismissed, and travelling on for weeks without hearing of any employment. And then it was that your little brother was born. Such a pretty baby he was, and I named him Arthur after my father. I was very, very poor when he was born, and I could hardly get clothes for him to wear. But oh, Rosalie darling, I loved him very much. I wrote to my mother to tell her about it, and that baby was to be christened after my father. But she sent back my letter unread, and I never wrote to her again. And one day, when I took up a newspaper, I saw my mother's death in it, and I heard afterwards that she said on her dying bed that I was not to be told of her death till she was put under the ground, for I had been a disgrace and a shame to the family, and that, they said, was the only time that she mentioned me, after the week that I ran away. My sister Lucy wrote me a very kind letter after my mother died, and sent me some presents, but I was sorry for it afterwards, for your father kept writing to her for money, and telling her long tales about the distress I was in to make her send us more. She often sent us money, but I felt as if I could not bear to take it, and she used to write to me such beautiful letters, and to beg me to come to Jesus, and to remember what my father had said to us when he died. She said Jesus had made her happy, and would make me happy too. I often think now of what she said, Rosalie. Well, after a time I heard that Lucy was married to a clergyman, and your father heard it too, and he kept writing to her and asking her for money again and again, and at last came a letter from her husband in which he said that he was very sorry to be obliged to tell us that his wife could do no more for us, and he requested that no more letters on the same subject might be addressed to her, as they would receive no reply. Your father wrote again, but they did not answer it, and since then they have left the town where they were living, and he lost all clue to them. And Rosalie, darling, I hope he will never find them again. I cannot bear to be an annoyance to my sister Lucy, my dear little sister Lucy. As for Gerald, he has taken no notice of us at all. Your father has written to him from time to time, but his letters have always been returned to him. Well, so we went on, getting poorer and poorer. Once your father took a situation as a postmaster in a small country village, and there was a lady there who was very kind to me. She used to come and see my little Arthur. He was very delicate, and at last he took a dreadful cold, and it settled on his chest, and my poor little lamb died. And Rosalie, darling, when I buried him under a little willow tree in that country churchyard, I felt as if I had nothing left to live for. We did not stay in that village long. We were neither of us used to keeping accounts, and we got them in a complete muddle, so I had to leave behind my little grave, and the only home we ever had. Then your father fell in with a strolling actor who was in the habit of frequenting fairs, and between them, by selling their furniture and almost everything they possessed, they bought some scenery and a caravan and started a travelling theatre, and when the man died, Rosalie, he left his share of it to your father. So the last 12 years, my darling, I've been moving about from place to place, just as we are doing now, and in this caravan, my little girl, you were born. I was very ill a long time after that, and could not take my place in the theatre, and for many reasons that was the most miserable part of my miserable life. And now, little woman, I've told you all I need tell you at present. Perhaps some day I can give you more particulars, but you will have some idea now why I'm so utterly wretched." "Yes, utterly wretched," said the poor woman. "No hope for this world, and no hope for the next." "Poor, poor mammy," said little Rosalie, stroking her hand very gently and tenderly. "Poor mammy dear." "It's all my own fault, child," said her mother. "I've brought it upon myself, and I've no one but myself to blame." "Poor, poor mammy," said Rosalie again. Then the sick woman seemed quite exhausted, and lay upon her bed for some time without speaking or moving. Rosalie sat by the door of the caravan and sang softly to herself, "Jesus, I thy face am seeking, early will I come to thee." "Oh, Rosalie," said her mother, looking round, "I didn't come to him early. Oh, if I only had! Mind you do, Rosie. It's so much easier for you now than when you get to be old and wicked like me." "Is that what 'in the sunshine of the morning' means in the next verse, mammy dear?" "Yes, Rosalie," said her mother, "it means when you're young and happy. Oh, dear, dear, if I'd only come to him then!" "Why don't you come now, mammy dear?" "I don't know. I don't expect he would take me now. Oh, I have been such a sinner. There are other things, child, I have not told you about, and they are all coming back to my mind now. I don't know how it is, Rosalie, I never thought so much of them before." "Perhaps the Good Shepherd is beginning to find you, mammy." "I don't know, Rosalie. I wish I could think that. Anyhow, they are all rising up as clear as if I saw them all. Some of them are things I did years and years ago, even when I was a little girl in that old home in the country. They are all coming back to me, and oh, I am so very, very miserable." "Rosalie," said her father's voice at the door of the caravan, "come into the next wagon. We've a new play on at this town, and you have your part to learn. Come away." So Rosalie had to leave her poor mother, and instead of singing the soothing words of the hymn, she had to repeat again and again the foolish and senseless words which had fallen to her share in the new play which her father was getting up. Over and over again she repeated them, till she was weary of their very sound, her father scolding her if she made a mistake, or failed to give each word its proper emphasis. And when she was released, it was time to get tea ready, and then they halted for the night at a small market town just 8 miles from Lesborough. where they were next to perform, and which they were to enter the next morning, as the fair began on Monday. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O. F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in January 2012. Chapter 7. The Circus Procession. It was a bright, sunshiny morning when the theatre party reached Lesborough. Not a cloud was to be seen in the sky, and Augustus was in capital spirits, for he thought that if the fine weather lasted, his profits would be larger than usual. On the road leading to the town they passed several small shows bound for the same destination. There was the show of the Lancashire Lass, the exhibition of the performing little pigs, Roderick Polglaze's living curiosities, and the show of the giant horse. Augustus knew the proprietor of nearly every caravan that passed them, and they exchanged greetings by the way, and congratulated each other on the fine weather which seemed to be before them. Then they drew near the town, and heard a tremendous noise in the distance. As they entered the main street, they saw a cloud of dust in front of them, and then an immense crowd of people. Rosalie and her mother came to the door of the caravan and looked out. Presently the dust cleared away, and showed them a glittering gilded car, which was coming towards them, surrounded by throngs of boys and girls, men and women. "What is it, Toby?" asked Rosalie. "It's a large circus, Miss Rosie. Master said they were going to be here, and he was afraid they would carry a good many people off from us." The theatre party had to draw up on one side of the street to let the long procession pass. First came a gilded car filled with musicians, who were playing a noisy tune. This was followed by about a dozen men on horseback, some dressed in shining armour, as knights of the olden time, and others as cavaliers of the time of the Stuarts. Then came another large gilded car, on the top of which was a golden dragon with coloured reins round its neck, which were held by an old man, dressed as an ancient Briton, and supposed to personate St. George. Then came a number of mounted ladies, dressed in brilliant velvet habits, one green, one red, one yellow, one violet, each of them holding long orange reins, which were fastened to spirited piebald horses which they drove before them. These were followed by a man riding on two ponies, standing with one on each leg, and going at a great pace. Then two little girls and a little boy passed on three diminutive ponies, and next a tiny carriage drawn by four little cream-coloured horses, and driven by a boy dressed as a Lord Mayor's coachman. Then came an absurd succession of clowns, driving, riding, or standing on donkeys, and dressed in hideous costumes. Then 3 or 4 very tall and fine horses, led by grooms in scarlet. And lastly, an enormous gilded car, drawn by 6 piebald horses, with coloured flags on their heads. On the top of this car sat a girl, intended for Britannia, dressed in white, with a scarlet scarf across her shoulders, a helmet on her head, and a trident in her hand. She was leaning against 2 large shields, which alone prevented her from falling from her giddy height. Some way below her, in front of the car, sat her 2 maidens, dressed in glittering silver tinsel, upon which the rays of the sun made it dazzling to look, whilst behind her, clinging to the back of the car, were 2 iron-clad men, whose scaly armour was also shining brightly. Then the procession was over, and there was nothing to be heard or seen but a noisy rabble, who were hastening on to get another glimpse of the wonderful sight. There were some girls standing near the caravan, close to Rosalie and her mother, as the circus procession passed, and they were perfectly enraptured with all they saw. When Britannia came in sight, they could hardly contain themselves, so envious were they of her. One of them told the other she would give anything to be sitting up there, dressed in gold and silver, and she thought Britannia must be as happy as Queen Victoria. "Oh," said Rosalie's mother, leaning out and speaking in a low voice, "you would soon get tired of it." "Not I," said the girl. "I only wish I had the chance." Rosalie's mother sighed, and said to Rosalie, "Poor things, they little know. I should not wonder if that poor girl is about as wretched as I am. But people don't consider, they know nothing about it. They have to be behind the scenes to know what it is like." Nothing further happened until the theatre party reached the place where the fair was to be held. It was a large open square in the middle of the town, which was generally used as a market place. Although it was only Saturday morning, and the fair was not to begin until Monday, many of the shows had already arrived. The marionettes and the wild beast show had completed their arrangements, and one of the whirligigs was already in action, and from time to time its proprietor rang a large bell to call together a fresh company of riders. The children had a holiday, as it was Saturday, and they rushed home and clamoured for pennies that they might spend them in sitting on a wooden horse, or elephant, or camel, or in one of the small omnibuses or open carriages, and then taken round by means of steam at a tremendous pace, till their breath was nearly gone, and when they alighted once more on the ground, they hardly knew where they were, or whether they were standing on their heads or on their feet. And for long after, many of these children were dizzy and sick, and felt as if they were walking on ground which gave way beneath them as they trod on it. As soon as Augustus arrived at the place where his theatre was to be erected, he and his men began their work. For the next few hours there was nothing to be heard on all sides but rapping and hammering, every one working with all his might to get everything finished before sunset. Each half hour fresh shows arrived, had their ground measured out for them by the market keeper, and began to unload and fasten up immediately. Rosalie stood at the door and looked out, but she had seen it all so often before that it was no amusement to her, and she felt very glad, as one by one the shows were finished and the hammering ceased. But just as she hoped that all was becoming quiet, she heard a dreadful noise at the back of the caravan. It was her father's voice, and he was in a towering passion with one of the men, who had annoyed him by neglecting to put up part of the scaffolding properly. The two men shouted at each other for some time, and a large number of people, who were strolling about amongst the shows, collected round them to see what was the matter. At length a policeman, seeing the crowd, came and ordered them off, and they were obliged to retreat inside the theatre. That night Augustus came into the caravan to smoke his pipe, and informed his wife that it was very well she was so much better, for he and Conrad had had a disagreement, and Conrad had taken his things and gone off, so of course she would have to take her part on Monday night. Rosalie looked at her mother, and Rosalie's mother looked at her, but neither of them spoke. But as soon as her father had left them for the night, Rosalie said, "Mammy dear, you'll never be able to stand all that long time. I'm sure it will make you worse, Mammy dear." "Never mind, Rosalie, it's no use telling your father. He thinks I'm only complaining if I do." "But oh, Mammy, what if it makes you bad again, as it did before?" "It can't be helped, child. I shall have to do it, so it's no use talking about it. I may as well do it without making a fuss about it. Your father is put out to-night, darling, and it would never do to annoy him more." But little Rosalie was not satisfied. She looked very tenderly and sorrowfully at her mother, and the next morning she went timidly to tell her father that she did not think her mother would ever get through her part. She was too weak for it. But he told her shortly to mind her own business, so little Rosalie could do nothing more. Nothing except watch her mother very carefully and gently all that long, dreary Sunday, scarcely allowing her to rise from her seat, but fetching her everything she wanted, and looking forward, sick at heart, to the morrow. The church bells chimed in all directions. Crowds of people in their Sunday clothes passed along the market-place to a church or chapel, but to Rosalie and her mother Sunday brought no joy. It was a fine, bright day, so most of the show people were roaming about the town, but Rosalie's mother was too weak to go out, and her little girl did not like to leave her. "Rosalie," said her mother that Sunday afternoon, "I'm going to give you a present." "A present for me, Mammy dear?" said Rosalie. "Yes, little woman. Pull that large box from under the bed. It's rather heavy, dear. Can you manage it?" "Oh yes, Mammy dear, quite well." Rosalie's mother sat down by the box and began to unpack it. At the top of the box were some of her clothes and Rosalie's, but it was a long time since she had turned out the things at the bottom of the box. She took out from it a small bundle pinned up in a towel. Then, calling Rosalie to her side, she drew out the pins one by one, and opened it. Inside were several small parcels carefully tied up in paper. In the first parcel was a little pair of blue shoes with a tiny red sock. "Those were my little Arthur's, Rosalie," said her mother with tears in her eyes. "I put them away the day he was buried, and I've never liked to part with them. No one will care for them when I'm gone, though," said she with a sigh. "Oh, Mammy dear," said Rosalie, "don't talk so." The next parcel contained a small square box, but before she opened it she went to the door and looked cautiously out. Then, after seeing that no one was near, she touched a spring, and took out of the velvet-lined case a beautiful little locket. There was a circle of pearls all around it, and the letters N.E.H. were engraved in a monogram outside. Then she opened the locket, and showed Rosalie the picture of a girl with a very sweet and gentle face, and large, soft brown eyes. "Rosalie, darling," said her mother, "that is my sister Lucy." Rosalie took the locket in her hand, and looked at it very earnestly. "Yes," said the poor woman, "that is my sister Lucy, my own sister Lucy. I haven't looked at it for many a day. I can hardly bear to look at it now, for I shall never see her again, never, darling. What's that, Rosalie?" she said fearfully, covering the locket with her apron, as some one passed the caravan. "It's only some men strolling through the fair, Mammy dear," said Rosalie. "Because I wouldn't have your father see this for the world. He would sell it if he did. I've hid it up all these years and never let him find it. I could not bear to part with it. She gave it to me my last birthday that I was at home. I remember it so well. Rosalie dear, I had been very disagreeable to Lucy a long time before that, for I knew I was doing wrong, and I had such a weight on my mind that I could not shake it off, and it made me cross and irritable. Lucy was never cross with me. She always spoke gently and kindly to me, and I sometimes even wished she would be angry, that I might have some excuse for my bad behaviour. Well, dear, when I woke that morning, I found this little box laid on my pillow, and a note with it, asking me to accept this little gift from my sister Lucy, and always to keep it for her sake. Oh, Rosalie, darling, wasn't it good of her, when I had been so bad to her? Well, I kissed her, and thanked her for it, and I wore it around my neck, and when I ran away that morning I put it safely in my bag, and I've kept it ever since. Your father has not seen it for many years, and he has forgotten all about it. When we were so poor, I used to be so afraid he would remember this locket and sell it, as he did all my other jewels. It was hard enough parting with some of them, but I did not care so much so long as I kept this one, for I promised Lucy that morning that I would never, never part with it." "It is pretty, Mammy dear," said Rosalie. "Yes, child, it will be yours some day when I die. Remember it is for you, but you must never let it be sold or pawned, Rosalie. I couldn't bear to think it ever would be. And now we'll put it back again. It won't be safe here. Your father might come in any minute." "Here's one more parcel, Mammy." "Yes, keep that out, dear. That's your present," said her mother. "I can't give you the locket yet, because I must keep it till I die, but you shall have the other to-day." She took off the paper and put into Rosalie's hands a small black Testament. The child opened the book and read on the fly-leaf, "Mrs. Augustus Joyce, from her friend Mrs. Bernard, in remembrance of little Arthur, and with the prayer that she may meet her child in heaven." "I promised her that I would read it, Rosalie, but I haven't," said the poor woman. "I read a few verses the first week she gave it to me, but I've never read it since. I wish I had. Oh, I do wish I had." "Let me read it to you, Mammy dear." "That's what I got it out for, darling. You might read a bit of it to me every day. I don't know whether it will do me any good. It's almost too late now, but I can but try." "Shall I begin at once, Mammy dear?" "Yes, directly, Rosalie. I'll just write your name in it, that you may always remember your mother when you see it." So Rosalie brought her a pen and ink, and she wrote at the bottom of the page, "My little Rosalie, with her mother's love." And now, child, you may begin to read. "What shall it be, mammy dear?" "Find the part about your picture, dear. I should think it will say under the text where it is." With some trouble Rosalie found Luke 15, and began to read. "And he spake this parable unto them, saying, What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness, and go after that which is lost, until he find it? And when he hath found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbours, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say unto you, that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons, which need no repentance." "I need repentance, Rosalie, child," said her mother. "What is repentance, mammy dear?" "It means being sorry for what you've done, Rosalie darling, and hating yourself for it, and wishing never to do wrong again." "Then, mammy, if you need repentance, you must be like the one sheep, not like the 99. "Yes, child, I'm a lost sheep, there's no doubt about that. I've gone very far astray, so far that I don't suppose I shall ever get back again. It's much easier to get wrong than to get right. It's a very, very hard thing to find the right road when you've once missed it. It doesn't seem much use my trying to get back. I have such a long way to go." "But, mammy dear, isn't it just like the sheep?" "What do you mean, Rosalie darling?" "Why, the sheep couldn't find its way back, could it, mammy? Sheep never can find their way. And this sheep didn't walk back, did it? He carried it on his shoulders, like my picture. I don't suppose it would seem so very far when he carried it." Rosalie's mother made no answer when her child said this, but she seemed to be thinking about it. She sat looking thoughtfully out of the window. Much, very much, was passing in her mind. Then Rosalie closed the Testament, and wrapping it carefully in the paper in which it had been kept so many years, she hid it away in the box again. It was Sunday evening now, and once more the church bells rang, and once more the people went past with books in their hands. Rosalie wished very much that she could creep into one of the churches and hear another sermon. But just then her father and the men came back and wanted their tea, and instead of the quiet service, Rosalie had to listen to their loud talking and noisy laughter. And then her father sent for her into the large caravan, and made her go through her part of the play. She was just finishing her recital as the people passed back again from evening service. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 8 Little Mother Manikin. It was Monday night, and Rosalie's mother was dressing herself to be ready to act in the play. Rosalie was standing beside her, setting out the folds of her white dress, and fetching everything she needed, her large necklace of pearl beads, the wreath of white lilies for her hair, and the bracelets, rings, and other articles of mock jewellery with which she was adorned. All these Rosalie brought to her, and the poor woman put them on one by one, standing before the tiny looking-glass to arrange them in their proper places. It was a very thin, sorrowful face which that glass reflected, so ill and careworn, so weary and sad. As soon as she was ready, she sat down on one of the boxes whilst Rosalie dressed herself. "Oh, mammy dear," said Rosalie, "I'm sure you are not fit to act to-night." "Hush, Rosalie," said her mother, "don't speak of that now. Come and sit beside me, darling, and let me do your hair for you, and before we go, Rosalie dear, sing your little hymn." Rosalie tried to sing it, but somehow her voice trembled, and she could not sing it very steadily. There was such a sad expression in her mother's face that, in the midst of the hymn, little Rosalie burst into tears and threw her arms around her mother's neck. "Don't cry, darling, don't cry," said her mother. "What is the matter with you, Rosalie?" "Oh, Mammy dear, I don't want you to go to-night." "Hush, little one, hush," said her mother. "Don't speak of that. Listen to me, dear. I want you to make your mother a promise to-night. I want you to promise me that, if ever you can escape from this life of misery, you will do so. It's not good for you, darling, all this wretched acting, and oh, it makes my heart ache every time you have to go to it. You'll leave it if you can, Rosalie, won't you?" "Yes, Mammy, if you'll come with me," said little Rosalie. The poor mother shook her head sorrowfully. "No, dear, I shall never leave the caravan now. I chose this life myself. I chose to live here, darling, and here I shall have to die. But you didn't choose it, child, and I pray every day that God may save you from it. You remember that little village where we passed through, where you got your card?" "Yes, Mammy dear, where we had the milk and bread." "Do you remember a house which I sent you to look at?" "Oh, yes, Mammy dear, the house with the pretty garden, and a lady and her little girl gathering roses." "That lady was my sister Lucy, Rosalie." "Aunt Lucy," said Rosalie. "Was it, Mammy dear? And was that little girl my cousin?" "Yes, darling. I knew it was your Aunt Lucy as soon as that young woman mentioned her name. Lucy married a Mr. Leslie, and it was just like her to read to those people in the cottages, just as she used to when we lived in that town of which I told you." "Then I've really seen her," said Rosalie. "Yes, darling, and now I want you to promise me that, if ever you have the opportunity of getting to your Aunt Lucy without your father knowing it, you'll go. I've written a letter to her, dear, and I've hid it away in that box inside the case where the locket is. And if ever you can go to your Aunt Lucy, give her that letter. You will, won't you, Rosalie? And show her that locket. She will remember it as soon as she sees it. And tell her, darling, that I never, never parted with it all these long, dreary years." "But why won't you come with me, Mammy dear?" "Don't ask me that now, darling. It's nearly time for us to go into the theatre, but before you go, just read those verses about your picture once through. We shall just about have time for it before your father comes." So Rosalie read once more the parable of the lost sheep. "Rosalie, child," said her mother, when she had finished, "there are 4 words in that story which I've had in my mind, oh, so many times since you read it last." "What are they, Mammy dear?" "Until he find it, Rosalie. All last night I lay awake coughing, and I kept thinking there was no hope for me. It was no use my asking the Good Shepherd to look for me. But all of a sudden those words came back to me just as if some one had said them to me. Until he find it. Until he find it. He goeth after that which is lost until he find it. It seems he doesn't give up at once. He goes on looking until he find it. And then it seemed to me, Rosalie, I don't know if I was right, I don't know if I even dare hope it, but it seemed to me last night that perhaps, if he takes such pains and looks so long, if he goes on until he find it, there might even be a chance for me." "Are you ready?" said Augustus's voice at the door of the caravan. "We're just going to begin." Rosalie and her mother jumped hastily up, and thrusting the Testament into the box, they hurried down the caravan steps and went into the theatre. There were still a few minutes before the performance commenced, and Rosalie made her mother sit down on a chair in the little room behind the stage, that she might rest as long as possible. Several of the company came up to the poor woman and asked her how she was, in tones which spoke of rough though kindly sympathy. Rosalie looked earnestly in their faces, and read there that they did not think her mother equal to her work, and it filled her little heart with sorrowful forebodings. She had never seen her mother look more lovely than she did at the beginning of the play. There was a bright colour in her face, and her beautiful eyes shone more brilliantly than ever before. Rosalie really hoped she must be better, to look so well as that. But there was a weary, sorrowful expression in her face which went to the child's heart. Her mother repeated the words of the play as if they were extremely distasteful to her, and as if she could hardly bear the sound of her own voice. In her eyes there was a wistful yearning, as if she were looking at and longing for something far, far away from the noisy theatre. She never smiled at the bursts of applause. She repeated her part almost mechanically, and from time to time Rosalie saw her mother's eyes fill with tears. She crept to her side and put her little hand in hers as they went up to the platform after the first performance was over. Her mother's hand was burning with a fever, and yet she shivered from head to foot as they went out on the platform into the chill night air. "Oh, mammy dear," said Rosalie in a whisper, "you ought to go back to the caravan now." But Rosalie's mother shook her head mournfully. About half-way through the next play there came a long piece which Rosalie had to recite alone, the piece which her father had been teaching her during the last week. She was just half-way through it, when suddenly her eyes fell on her mother, who was standing at the opposite side of the stage, in a tragical position. All the colour had gone from her face, and it seemed to Rosalie that each moment her face was growing whiter and more death-like. She quite forgot the words she was saying. All remembrance of them faded from her mind. She came to a sudden stop. Her father's promptings were all in vain. She could hear nothing he said. She could see nothing but her mother's sorrowful and ghastly face. And then her mother fell, and some of the actors carried her from the room. Rosalie rushed forward to follow her, and the noise in the theatre became deafening. But she was stopped on the stairs by her father, who blamed her most cruelly for breaking down in her part, and ordered her to return immediately and finish, accompanying his command with most awful threatenings if she refused to obey. Poor little Rosalie went on with her recital, trembling in every limb. Her mother's place was taken by another actor, and the play went on as before. But Rosalie's heart was not there. It was filled with a terrible, sickening dread. What had become of her mother? Who was with her? Were they taking care of her? And then a horrible fear came over her lest her mother should be dead, lest, when she went into the caravan again, she should only see her mother's body stretched upon the bed, lest she should never, never hear her mother speak to her again. As soon as the play was over, she went up to her father, and, in spite of the annoyed expression of his face, begged him to allow her to leave the theatre and to go to her mother. But he told her angrily that she had spoilt his profits quite enough for one night, and she must take care how she dared to do so again. Oh, what a long night that seemed to Rosalie! When they went out on the platform between the performances, she gazed earnestly in the direction of her mother's caravan. A light seemed to be burning inside, but more than that Rosalie could not see. It seemed as if the long hours would never pass away. Each time she went through her recital she felt glad that she had at least once less to say it. Each time that the town hall clock struck, she counted the hours before the theatre would close. And yet, when all was over, and when Rosalie was at length allowed to return to the caravan, she hardly dared to enter it. What would she find within? Was her mother dead? And was her father hiding it from her till her part was over, lest she should break down again? Very, very gently she opened the door. There was a candle burning on the table, and by its light Rosalie could see her mother lying on the bed. She was very pale, and her eyes were tightly closed. But she was breathing. She was not dead. The relief was so great that Rosalie burst into tears. When she first came into the caravan, she thought that her mother was alone, but a small, hoarse whisper came from the corner of the caravan. "Don't be frightened, my dear," said the voice. "It's only me. Toby told me about your mother, and so I came to visit with her till you came." Rosalie walked to her mother's side, and on the box by the bed she found a little creature about 3 feet high, with a very old and wrinkled face. "Who are you?" said Rosalie. "I belong to the dwarf show, my dear," said the old woman. "There are 4 of us there, and not one of us is more than 3 feet high." "But isn't it going on to night?" said Rosalie. "Yes, it's going on, my dear, it always goes on," said the tiny old woman. "But I'm old and ugly, you see, so I can be better spared than the others. I only go in sometimes, my dear. Old age must have its liberties, you see." "Thank you so much for taking care of my mother," said Rosalie. "Has she spoken to you yet?" "Yes, my dear," said the old woman, "she spoke once, but I couldn't well hear what she said. I tried to reach up near to her mouth to listen, but you see I'm only 3 feet high, so I couldn't quite manage it. I thought it was something about a sheep, but of course it couldn't be that, my dear. There are no sheep here." "Oh, yes," said Rosalie, "that would be it. We had been reading about sheep before we went into the theatre." Just then a noise was heard at the door of the caravan, and Augustus entered. He went up to his wife and felt her pulse. Then he muttered, "She's all right now. Let her have a good sleep, that's all she wants, Rosalie." He looked curiously at the dwarf, and then left the caravan and shut the door. "Rosalie," said the tiny old woman when he had gone, "I'll stop with you to-night if you like." "Oh, would you?" said little Rosalie. "I should be so glad." She felt as if she could not bear all those long, dark hours alone beside her unconscious mother. "Yes," said the dwarf, "I'll stay, only you must go and tell them in our tent. Can you find it, do you think?" "Where is it?" said Rosalie. The little old woman described the situation of the tent, and Rosalie put a shawl over her head and went in search of it. There were some stalls still lighted up, and the flaring naphtha showed Rosalie an immense picture hanging over the tent, representing a number of diminutive men and women, and above the picture there was a board on which was written in large letters, "The Royal Show of Dwarfs." Rosalie had some difficulty in finding the entrance to this show. She groped round it several times, pulling at the canvas in different places, but all to no purpose. Then she heard voices within, laughing and talking. Going as near to these as possible, she put her mouth to a hole in the canvas, and called out, "Please, will you let me in? I've brought a message from the little lady that lives here." There was a great shuffling in the tent after this, and a clinking and chinking of money. Then a piece of the canvas was pulled aside, and a little squeaky voice called out, "Come in, whoever you are, and let us hear what you have got to say." So Rosalie crept in through the canvas, and stepped into the middle of the tent. It was a curious scene which she saw when she looked around. 3 little dwarfs stood before her, dressed in the most extraordinary costumes, and far above, over their heads, there towered a tall and very thin giant. Not one of the tiny dwarfs came up to his elbow. On the floor were scattered tiny tables, diminutive chairs, and dolls' umbrellas, which the little people had been using in their performance. "What is it, my dear?" said the giant loftily, as Rosalie entered. "Please," said Rosalie, "I've brought a message from the little lady that belongs to this show." "Mother Manikin," said one of the dwarfs in an explanatory tone. "Yes, Mother Manikin," repeated the giant, and the 2 other dwarfs nodded their heads in assent. "My mother's very ill," said Rosalie, "and she's taking care of her, and she's going to stay all night, and I was to tell you." "All right," said the giant majestically. "All right, all right, all right," echoed the 3 little dwarfs. Then the 2 little dwarfs seized Rosalie by the hand and wanted her to sit down and have supper with them. But Rosalie steadily declined. She must not leave her mother nor Mother Manikin. "Quite right," said the giant in a superior voice. "Quite right, child." "Quite right, child, quite right," repeated the 3 little dwarfs. Then they escorted Rosalie to the door of the show and bowed her gracefully out. "Tell Mother Manikin not to come home in daylight," called the giant, as Rosalie was disappearing through the canvas. "No, no," said the 3 dwarfs, "not in daylight." "Why not?" said Rosalie. "Our pennies," said the giant mysteriously. "Yes, our pennies and halfpennies for seeing the show. repeated the dwarfs. "We must not make ourselves too cheap." "Good night, child," said the giant. "Good night, child," said the dwarfs. Sorrowful as she was, they almost made Rosalie smile. They were such tiny little creatures to call her "child" in that superior manner. But she hastened back to the caravan, and after telling Mother Manikin that she had delivered her message to her friends, she took up her place by her mother's side. It was a great comfort having little Mother Manikin there. She was so kind and considerate, so thoughtful and clever, and she always seemed to know exactly what she wanted, though Rosalie's mother was too weak to ask for anything. All night long the poor woman lay still, sometimes entirely unconscious, at other times opening her eyes and trying to smile at poor little Rosalie, who was sitting at the foot of the bed. Mother Manikin did everything that had to be done. She was evidently accustomed to a sick room, and knew the best way of making those she nursed comfortable. She climbed on a chair and arranged the pillows so that the sick woman could breathe most easily, and after a time she made the poor tired child take off her white dress and lie down at the foot of the bed, wrapped in a woolen shawl. And in a few minutes Rosalie fell asleep. When she awoke, the gray light was stealing in at the caravan window. She raised herself on the bed and looked round. At first she thought she was dreaming, but presently the recollection of the night before came back to her. There was her mother sleeping quietly on the bed, and there was little Mother Manikin sitting faithfully at her post, never having allowed herself to sleep all that long night, lest the sick woman should wake and want something which she could not get. "Oh, Mother Manikin," said Rosalie, getting down from the bed and throwing her arms round the little old woman's neck, "how good you are!" "Hush, child," said the dwarf, "don't wake your mother. She's sleeping so peacefully now, and has been for the last hour." "I'm so glad," said Rosalie. "Do you think she will soon be better, Mother Manikin?" "I can't say, my dear. We'll leave that just now. Tell me what that picture is about up there. I've been looking at it all night." "Oh, that's my picture," said Rosalie. "That shepherd has been looking for that lamb all over, and at last he has found it, and is carrying it home on his shoulder, and he is so glad it is found, though he has hurt himself very much in looking for it." "And what is that reading underneath?" said the little old woman. "I can't read, my dear. You see, I am no scholar." "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. There is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." "What does that mean, child?" said the old woman. "It means Jesus is like the shepherd, and he is looking for us, Mother Manikin, and it makes him so glad when he finds us." The dwarf nodded her head in assent. "We ask him every day to find us, Mother Manikin, Mammy and me, and the story says he will look for us until he finds us. Shall I read it to you? It's what Mammy and I were reading before we went into the play." Rosalie went to the box and brought out the little black Testament, and then, sitting at Mother Manikin's feet, she read her favorite story of the lost sheep. "Has he found you, Mother Manikin?" she asked, as she closed the book. The little dwarf put her head on one side, and smoothed her tiny gray curls, but made no answer. Rosalie was almost afraid she had vexed her, and did not like to say anything more. But a long time afterwards, so long that Rosalie had been thinking of a dozen things since, Mother Manikin answered her question and said in a strange whisper, "No, child, he hasn't found me." "Won't you ask him, dear Mother Manikin?" said Rosalie. "Yes, child, I'll begin to-day," said the little dwarf. "I'll begin now, if you'll say the words for me." Rosalie slipped down from her stool, and kneeling on the floor of the caravan, she said aloud, "Oh, good shepherd, you are looking for Mammy and me. Please look for Mother Manikin too, and please put her on your shoulder and carry her home. Amen." "Amen," said old Mother Manikin in her hoarse whisper. She did not talk any more after this. About 6 o'clock there came a rap on the caravan door, and a woman, in a long cloak appeared, asking if Mother Manikin were there. She belonged to the Royal Show of Dwarfs, and had come to take Mother Manikin home before the business of the market-place commenced. Some men were already passing by to their work, so the woman wrapped Mother Manikin in a shawl, and carried her home like a baby, covering her with her cloak so that no one should see who she was. Rosalie thanked her with tears in her eyes for all her kindness, and the little woman promised soon to come again and see how her patient was. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 9. The Doctor's Visit. Rosalie was not long alone after Mother Manikin left her. There was a rap at the door, and on opening it she found Toby. "Miss Rosie," he said, "how is she now?" "I think she is sleeping quietly, Toby," said Rosalie. "I would have come before, but I was afraid of disturbing her," said Toby. "I've been thinking of her all night. I didn't get many winks of sleep, Miss Rosie." "Oh, Toby, was it you that fetched little Mother Manikin?" "Yes, Miss Rosie. I used to belong to their show before I came to master, and once I had a fever, and Mother Manikin nursed me all the time I had it, so I knew she would know what to do." "She is a kind little thing," said Rosalie. "Yes, missy, she's only got a little body, but there's a great kind heart inside it. But, Miss Rosie, I wanted to tell you something. I'm going to fetch a doctor to see missus." "Oh, Toby, but what will my father say?" "It's he that has sent me, Miss Rosie. You see, I think he's ashamed. You should have seen the men last night, when they were shutting up the theatre after you had gone away. They went up to master and gave him a bit of their minds about letting missus come on the stage when she was so ill. They told him it was a sin and a shame the way he treated her, taking less care of her than if she were one of his old horses. Not that he's over and above good to them neither. Well, master didn't like it, Miss Rosie, and he was very angry at the time. But this morning, as soon as it was light, he told me to get up at 7 o'clock and fetch a doctor to see missus at once. So I thought I'd better tell you, Miss Rosie, that you might put things straight before he comes." As soon as Toby had gone, Rosalie put the caravan in order, and awaited anxiously the doctor's arrival. Her father brought him in, and stayed in the caravan whilst he felt the poor woman's pulse, and asked Rosalie several questions about her cough, which from time to time was so distressing. Then they went out together, and little Rosalie was left in suspense. She had not dared to ask the doctor what he thought of her mother when her father was present, and her little heart was full of anxious fear. Augustus came in soon after the doctor had left, and Rosalie crept up to him and asked what he had said of her mother. "He says she is very ill," said her father shortly, and in a voice which told Rosalie that she must ask no more questions. And then he sat down beside the bed for about half an hour, and looked more softened than Rosalie had ever seen him before. She was sure the doctor must have told him that her mother was very bad indeed. Rosalie's father did not speak. There was no sound in the caravan but the ticking of the little clock which was fastened to a nail in the corner, and the occasional falling of the cinders in the ash pan. Augustus's reflections were not pleasant as he sat by his wife's dying bed, for the doctor had told him she would never be better, and it was only a question of time how long she would live. And when Augustus heard that, all his cruel treatment came back to his mind, the hard words he had spoken to her, the unkind things she had said of her, and, above all, the hard-hearted way in which he had made her come on the stage the night before, when she was almost too ill to stand. All these things crowded in upon his memory, and a short fit of remorse seized him. It was this which led him, contrary to his custom, to come into the caravan to sit by her side. But his meditations became so unpleasant at length that he could bear them no longer. He could not sit there and face the accusations of his conscience. So he jumped up hastily and went out without saying a word to his child, slammed the little caravan door after him, and sauntered down the market-place. Here he met some of his friends, who rallied him on his melancholy appearance, and offered to treat him to a glass in the nearest public-house. And there Augustus Joyce banished all thoughts of his wife, and stifled the loud, accusing voice of his conscience. When he returned to the theatre for dinner, he appeared as hard and selfish as ever, and never even asked how his wife was before he sat down to eat. Perhaps he dreaded to hear the answer to that question. And that evening Rosalie was obliged to take her part in the play. Her father insisted on it. It was impossible for him to spare her, he said, and to fill up both her place and her mother's also. Rosalie begged him most earnestly to excuse her, but all in vain, so with an aching heart she went to the royal show of dwarfs and asked for Mother Manikin. The good little woman was indignant when Rosalie told her she was not allowed to stay with her mother, and promised immediately to come and sit beside the poor woman in her absence. The other dwarfs rather grumbled at this arrangement, but Mother Manikin shook her little fist at them, and called them hard-hearted creatures, and declared that old age must have its liberties. She had been entertaining the company all the afternoon, and must have a little rest this evening. "Oh, Mother Manikin," said Rosalie, "and you had no sleep last night?" "Oh, my dear, I'm all right," said the good little woman. "I had a nap or two this morning. Don't trouble about me. And Miss Mab and Master Puck ought to be ashamed of themselves for wanting me when there's that poor dear thing so ill out there. Bless me, my dears," said the old woman, turning to the dwarfs, "what should you want with an ugly little thing like me? It's you lovely young creatures that the company come to see. So I wish you good night, my dears. Take care of yourselves, and don't get into any mischief when I'm away. Where's Susanna?" "Here I am," said the woman who had come for Mother Manikin that morning. "Carry me to Joyce's van," said the little old woman, jumping on a chair and holding out her arms. Susanna wrapped her in her cloak and took her quickly in the direction of the theatre, Rosalie walking by her side. Then the little woman helped the child to dress, pulling out the folds of her white dress for her, and combing her long hair in a most motherly fashion. When the child was ready, she stood looking sorrowfully at her mother's pale face. But as she was looking, her mother's eyes opened and gazed lovingly and tenderly at her, and then, to the child's joy, her mother spoke. "Rosalie, darling," she whispered, "I feel better tonight. Kiss your mother, Rosie." The child bent down and kissed her mother's face, and her long dark hair lay across her mother's pillow. "Who is it taking care of me, Rosalie?" "It's a little lady Toby knows, mammy dear. She's so kind, and she says she will sit with you all the time I'm out. I didn't want to leave you. Oh, I wanted so much to stay, but I could not be spared, father says." "Never mind, darling," said her mother. "I feel a little better tonight. I should like a cup of tea." Mother Manikin had a cup of tea ready almost directly. She was the quickest little body Rosalie had ever seen, yet she was so quiet that her quick movements did not in the least disturb the sick woman. "How kind you are," said Rosalie's mother, as the dwarf climbed on a chair to give her the tea. "There's nothing like tea," said the tiny old woman, nodding her wise little head. "Give me a cup of tea, and I don't care what I go without. You're better tonight, ma'am." "Yes," said Rosalie's mother, "I can talk a little now. I heard a great deal you said before, though I could not speak to you. I heard you talking about Rosalie's picture." "To think of that!" said the little old woman cheerily. "To think of that, Rosalie! Why, she heard us talking. Bless me, child, she's not so bad after all." "I think it did me good," said the poor woman. "I heard Rosalie pray." "Yes," said Mother Manikin, "she put me in her prayer. Bless her! I haven't forgotten that." Then Rosalie's mother seemed very tired, and her careful nurse would not let her talk any more, but made her lie quite quietly without moving. When Rosalie left her to go on the stage, she was sleeping peacefully, with kind Mother Manikin sitting by her side. And when the child returned late at night, there she was sitting still, and she insisted on Rosalie's undressing and creeping into bed beside her mother, that she might have a proper night's rest. For poor little Rosalie was completely exhausted with the stifling air, the fatigue, and the anxiety to which she had been subjected. The next day her mother seemed to have revived a little, and was able to take a little food, and to talk to her in whispers from time to time. "Rosalie," she said that afternoon, "there is a verse come back to me which our old nurse taught me. I haven't thought of it for years, but that night when I was so ill, I woke saying it." "What is it, mammy dear?" said Rosalie. "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. That was it, dear." "Mother Manikin told me you said something about sheep, mammy." "Yes, that was it," said the poor woman. "It's such a beautiful verse. All we like sheep have gone astray. That's just like me, darling. I've gone astray, oh, so far astray. And have turned every one to his own way. That's me again. My own way, that's just what it was. I chose it myself. I would have my own way. It's just like me, Rosalie." "And what's the end of the verse, mammy dear?" "The Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all." That means Jesus. The Lord put all our sins on him when he died on the cross." "Did he put your sins on Jesus, mammy dear?" "Yes, child. I think it must mean mine, because it says, the iniquity of us all. I think all must take me in, Rosalie. At least I hope so. I have been asking him to let it take me in, because, you know, if the sin is laid on him, Rosie darling, I shan't have to bear it too." The poor woman was quite exhausted when she had said this, and Rosalie brought her some beef tea which Mother Manikin had made for her, and which was simmering on the stove. The good little woman came once more to stay with Rosalie's mother whilst the play was going on. The theatre closed rather early that night, for a large fair was to be held at a town some way off, at which Augustus Joyce was very anxious to be present, and as he did not think there was much more to be done in Lesborough, he determined to start at once. So, the moment that the last person had left the theatre, Augustus and his men hastily put off the clothes in which they had been acting, slipped on their working coats, and began to pull down the scenery. All night long they were hammering and knocking down and packing up, and when morning dawned they were ready to start. They were not the only ones who had been packing up all night. There were several other fairs drawing near, at which the show people had taken ground, so they worked away as those who had no time to lose. "Miss Rosie," said Toby's voice, at about 5 o'clock that morning, "they are all going off except us. Master says we can wait a bit longer, to give missus a little more rest. He and the other men are going off at once, to get the theatre set up and everything ready, and master says it will be time enough if we are there by the first night of the fair. He can't do without you then, he says." "I'm very glad mammy hasn't to be moved just yet," said Rosalie. "The shaking would hurt her so much, I'm sure." Augustus came into the caravan for a few minutes before he set off. He told Rosalie that they might stay 2 days longer, but on Saturday morning they must be off early, so as to get into the town on Sunday night. "I wouldn't have you away from the play in this town, Rosalie, not for the world. It's a large seaside place, and I hope to make a pretty penny there, if every one does their duty." "Augustus," said his wife in a trembling voice, "can you stay 5 minutes with me before you go?" "Well," said Augustus, taking out his watch, "perhaps I might spare 5 minutes, but you must be quick. I ought to be off by now." "Rosalie, darling," said her mother, "leave me and your father alone." Little Rosalie went down the steps of the caravan, shutting the door gently behind her, and stood watching her father's men, who were yoking the horses in the wagons and tying ropes round the different loads, to prevent anything falling off. As soon as she was gone, her mother laid her hand on her husband's arm, and said, "Augustus, there are two things I want to ask you before I die." "What are they?" said the man shortly, crossing his legs and leaning back on his chair. "The first is, Augustus, that you will find a home for Rosalie when I'm dead. Don't take her about from fair to fair. She will have no mother to take care of her, and I can't bear to think of her being left here all alone." "All alone?" said Augustus angrily. "She will have me. She will be all right if I'm here, and I'm not going to let the child go just when she's beginning to be useful. Besides, where would you have her go?" Rosalie's mother did not tell the secret hope which was in her heart. "I thought," she said, "you might find some motherly body in the country somewhere, who would take care of her for very little money, and would send her to school regularly, and see she was brought up properly." "Oh, nonsense," said Augustus. "She will be all right with me, and I'm not going to lose a pretty child like that from the stage. Why, half the people come to see the lovely little actress, as they call her. I know better than to spoil her for acting by putting her down in some slow country place. Well, the 5 minutes are up," said Augustus, looking at his watch. "I must be off." "There was something else I wanted to ask you, Augustus." "Well, what is it? Be quick." "I wanted to tell you that the last fortnight I have been feeling that when one comes to die, there is nothing in this world worth having except to know that your soul is safe. I've led a wicked life, Augustus. I've often been disagreeable and bad to you, but all my desire now is that the Good Shepherd should seek me and find me before it is too late." "Is that all?" said her husband, putting on his coat. "No, Augustus, I wanted to ask you something. Are you ready to die?" "There's time enough to think of that," said her husband with a laugh. Yet there was an uneasy expression in his face as he said it, which showed that the answer to the question was not a satisfactory one. "Oh, Augustus, you don't know how long there may be," said his poor wife sorrowfully. "Well," said he, "if life's so short, we must get all the play we can out of it." "But what of the other life, Augustus, the long life that's coming?" "Oh, that may take care of itself," said her husband scornfully, as he lighted his pipe at the stove, and, wishing his wife a pleasant journey, he went down the steps of the caravan and closed the door. The poor wife turned over on her pillow and wept. She had made a very great effort in speaking to her husband, and it had been of no avail. She was so spent and exhausted that, had it not been for Mother Manikin's beef tea, which Rosalie gave her as soon as she came in, she must have fainted from very weariness. A few minutes afterwards the wagons rumbled past, the theatre party set off on their journey, and Rosalie and her mother were left alone. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 10. Britannia. All day long the packing up went on, and one by one the shows moved off, and the market-place became more empty. In the afternoon Toby came to the caravan to inform Rosalie that the Royal Show of Dwarfs was just going to start, and Mother Manikin wanted to say good-bye to her. "Mind you thank her, Rosalie," said the sick woman, "and give her my love." "Yes, mammy dear," said the child, "I won't forget." She found the four little dwarfs sitting in a tiny covered wagon in which they were to take their journey. Rosalie was cautiously admitted, and the door closed carefully after her. Mother Manikin took leave of her with tears in her eyes. They were not going to the same fair as Rosalie's father, and she did not know when they would meet again. She gave Rosalie very particular directions about the beef tea, and slipped in her pocket a tiny parcel, which she told her to give to her mother. And then she whispered in Rosalie's ear, "I haven't forgot to ask the Good Shepherd to find me, child, and don't you leave me out, my dear, when you say your prayers at night." "Come, Mother Manikin," said Master Puck, "we must be off." Mother Manikin shook her fist at him, saying, "Old age must have its liberties, and young things should not be so impatient." Then she put her little arms around Rosalie's neck and kissed and hugged her, and the three other dwarfs insisted on kissing her too, and as soon as Rosalie had gone, the signal was given for their departure, and the royal show of dwarfs left the market-place. Rosalie ran home to her mother and gave her Mother Manikin's parcel. There were several paper wrappings, which the child took off one by one, and then came an envelope, inside which was a piece of money. She took it out and held it up to her mother. It was a half sovereign. Good little Mother Manikin! She had taken that half sovereign from her small bag of savings, and had put it in that envelope with even a gladder heart than Rosalie's mother had when she received it. "Oh, Rosalie," said the sick woman, "I can have some more beef tea now." "Yes," said the child, "I'll get the meat at once." And it was not only at her evening prayer that Rosalie mentioned Mother Manikin's name that day. It was not only then that she knelt down to ask the Good Shepherd to seek and to save little Mother Manikin. All day long Rosalie sat by her mother's side, watching her tenderly and carefully, and trying to imitate Mother Manikin in the way she arranged her pillows and waited upon her. And when evening came, the large square was quite deserted, except by the scavengers, who were going from one end to another, sweeping up the rubbish which had been left behind by the showmen. Rosalie felt very lonely the next day. Toby had slept at an inn in the town, and was out all day at a village some miles off, to which his master had sent him to procure something he wanted at a sale there. The market-place was quite empty, and no one came near the one solitary caravan. No one, except an officer of the Board of Health, to inquire what was the cause of the delay, and whether the sick woman was suffering from an infectious complaint. People passed down the market-place and went to the various shops, but no one came near Rosalie and her mother. The sick woman slept the greater part of the day, and spoke very little, but every now and then the child heard her repeat to herself the last verse of her little hymn: "Lord, I come without delaying. To thine arms at once I flee, lest no more I hear thee saying, Come, come to me." And then night came, and Rosalie sat by her mother's side, for she did not like to go to sleep lest she should wake and want something. And oh, what a long night it seemed! The town hall clock struck the quarters, but that was the only sound that broke the stillness. Rosalie kept a light burning, and every now and then mended the little fire, that the beef tea might be ready whenever her mother wanted it. And many times she gazed at her picture, and wished she were the little lamb safe in the Good Shepherd's arms, for she felt weary and tired, and longed for rest. The next morning the child heard Toby's voice as soon as it was light. "Miss Rosie," he said, "can I come in for a minute?" Rosalie opened the door, and Toby was much distressed to see how ill and tired she looked. "You mustn't make yourself ill, Miss Rosie, you really mustn't," he said reproachfully. "I'll try not, Toby," said the child. "Perhaps the country air will do me good." "Yes, missy, maybe it will. I think we'd better start at once, because I don't want to go fast. The slower we go the better it will be for missus, and then we will stop somewhere for the night. If we come to a village, we can stop there, and I'll get a hole in some barn to creep into, or if there's no village convenient, there's sure to be a haystack. I've slept on a haystack before this, Miss Rosie." In about half an hour Toby had made all ready, and they left the market-place. Very slowly and carefully he drove, yet the shaking tried Rosalie's mother much. Her cough was exceedingly troublesome, and her breathing was very sad. She was obliged to be propped up with pillows, and even then she could hardly breathe. The child opened the caravan door, and every now and then spoke to Toby, who was sitting just underneath it. He did not whistle to-day, nor call out to his horse, but seemed very thoughtful and quiet. Towards evening Rosalie's mother fell asleep. Such a sweet, peaceful sleep it was, that the child could but wish it to continue. It made her so glad to hear the coughing cease and the breathing become more regular, and she dreaded lest any jolting of the cart should awake her and make her start up again. "What do you think of stopping here for the night, Miss Rosie?" said Toby. They had come to a very quiet and solitary place on the borders of a large moor. A great pine forest stretched on one side of them, and the trees looked dark and solemn in the fading light. At the edge of this wood was a stone wall against which Toby drew up the caravan, that it might be sheltered from the wind. On the other side of the road was the moor, stretching on for miles and miles, and on this moor, in a little sheltered corner surrounded by furze bushes, Toby had determined to sleep. "I shall be close by, Miss Rosie," he said. "I sleep pretty sound, but if you call out 'Toby,' I shall be at your side in a twinkling. I always wake in a trice when I hear my name called. You won't be frightened, Miss Rosie, will you?" "No," said Rosalie, "I think not." But she gazed rather fearfully down the road at the corner of which they had drawn up. The trees were throwing dark shadows across the path, and their branches were waving gloomily in the evening breeze. Rosalie shivered a little as she looked at them and at the dark pine forest behind her. "I'll tell you what, Miss Rosie," said Toby, as he finished eating his supper. "I'll sit on the steps of the caravan, if you are frightened at all. No, no, you never mind me. I shall be all right. One night sitting up won't hurt me." But Rosalie would not allow it. She insisted on Toby's going to sleep on the heather, and made him take her mother's warm shawl, that he might wrap himself in it, for it was a very cold night. Then she carefully bolted the caravan door, closed the windows, and crept to her sleeping mother's side. She sat on the bed, put her head on the pillow, and tried to sleep also. But the intense stillness was oppressive, and made her head ache, for she kept sitting up in bed to listen and to strain her ears, longing for any sound to break the silence. Yet when a sound did come, when the wind swept over the fir trees and made the branches which hung over the caravan creak and sway to and fro, Rosalie trembled with fear. Poor child, the want of sleep the last few nights was telling on her, and had made her nervous and sensitive. At last she found the matches and lighted a candle, that she might not feel quite so lonely. Then she took her Testament from the box and began to read. As she read, little Rosalie felt no longer alone. She had a strange realization of the Good Shepherd's presence, and a wonderful feeling that her prayer was heard, and that he was indeed carrying her in his bosom. If it had not been for this, she would have screamed with horror when, about an hour afterwards, there came a tap at the caravan door. Rosalie jumped from her seat and peeped out between the muslin curtains. She could just see a dark figure crouching on the caravan steps. "Is it you, Toby?" she asked, opening the window cautiously. "No, it's me," said a girl's voice. "Have you got a fire in there?" "Who are you?" said Rosalie fearfully. "I'll tell you when I get in," said the girl. "Let me come and warm myself by your fire." Rosalie did not know what to do. She did not much like opening the door, for how could she tell who this stranger might be? She had almost determined to call Toby, when the sound of sobbing made her change her mind. "What's the matter?" she said, addressing the girl. "I'm cold and hungry and miserable," she said with a sob, "and I saw your light, and I thought you would let me come in." Rosalie hesitated no longer. She unbolted the door, and the dark figure on the steps came in. She drew off a long cloak with which she was covered, and Rosalie could see that she was quite a young girl, about 17 years old, and that she had been crying until her eyes were swollen and red. She was as cold as ice. There seemed to be no feeling in her hands, and her teeth chattered as she sat down on the bench by the side of the stove. Rosalie put some cold tea into a little pan and made it hot, and when the girl had drunk this, she seemed better and more inclined to talk. "Is that your mother?" she said, glancing at the bed where Rosalie's mother was still sleeping peacefully. "Yes," said Rosalie in a whisper. "We mustn't wake her. She's very, very ill. That's why we didn't start with the rest of the company, and the doctor has given her some medicine to make her sleep whilst we're travelling." "I have a mother," said the girl. "Have you?" said Rosalie. "Where is she?" But the girl did not answer this question. She buried her face in her hands and began to cry again. Rosalie looked at her very sorrowfully. "I wish you would tell me what's the matter," she said. "And who are you?" "I'm Britannia," said the girl, without looking up. "Britannia?" repeated Rosalie in a puzzled voice. "What do you mean?" "You were at Lesborough, weren't you?" said the girl. "Yes, we just come from Lesborough." "Then you didn't see the circus there?" "Oh, yes," said Rosalie. "The procession passed us on the road as we were going into the town." "Well, I'm Britannia," said the girl. "Didn't you see me on the top of the last car? I had a white dress on and a scarlet scarf." "Yes," said Rosalie, "I remember, and a great fork in your hand." "Yes, they call it a trident, and they called me Britannia." "But what are you doing here?" asked the child. "I've run away. I couldn't stand it any longer. I'm going home." "Where is your home?" asked Rosalie. "Oh, a long way off," she said. "I don't suppose I shall ever get there. I haven't a penny in my pocket, and I'm tired out already. I've been walking all night and all day." Then she began to cry again, and sobbed so loudly that Rosalie was afraid she would wake and alarm her mother. "Oh, Britannia," she said, "don't cry. Tell me what's the matter." "Call me by my own name," said the girl with another sob. "I'm not Britannia now. I'm Jessie. Little Jess, my mother always calls me." And at the mention of her mother she cried again as if her heart would break. "Jessie," said Rosalie, laying her hand on her arm, "won't you tell me about it?" The girl stopped crying, and as soon as she was calmer, she told Rosalie her story. "I've got such a good mother, it's that which made me cry," she said. "Your mother isn't in the circus then, is she?" asked Rosalie. "Oh, no," and she almost smiled through her tears. Such a sad, sorrowful attempt at a smile it was. "You don't know my mother, or you wouldn't ask that. No, she lives in a village a long way from here. I'm going to her, at least I think I am. I don't know if I dare." "Why not?" said Rosalie. "Are you frightened of your mother?" "No, I'm not frightened of her," said the girl, "but I've been so bad to her. I'm almost ashamed to go back. She doesn't know where I am. I expect she has had no sleep since I ran away." "When did you run away?" asked the child. "It will be 3 weeks ago now," said Jessie mournfully, "but it seems more like 3 months. I never was so wretched in all my life before. I've cried myself to sleep every night." "Whatever made you leave your mother?" said Rosalie. "It was that circus. It came to the next town to where we lived. All the girls in the village were going to it, and I wanted to go with them, and my mother wouldn't let me." "Why not?" "She said I should get no good there, that there was a great many bad people went to such places, and I was better away." "Then how did you see it?" said Rosalie. "I didn't see it that day, and at night the girls came home and told me all about it, and what a fine procession it was, and how the ladies were dressed in silver and gold, and the gentlemen in shining armor, and then I almost cried with disappointment because I had not seen it too. The girls said it would be in the town one more day, and then it was going away, and when I got into bed that night I made up my mind that I would go and have a look at it the next day." "But did your mother let you?" said Rosalie. "No, I knew it was no use asking her. I meant to slip out of the house before she knew anything about it. But it so happened that that day she was called away to the next village to see my aunt, who was ill." "And did you go when she was out?" "Yes, I did," said Jessie, "and I told her a lie about it." This was said with a great sob, and the poor girl's tears began to flow again. "What did you say?" asked little Rosalie. "She said to me before she went, 'Little Jess, you'll take care of Maggie and the baby, won't you, dear? You'll not let any harm come to them?' And I said, 'No, mother, I won't.' But as I said it, my cheeks turned hot, and I felt as if my mother must see how they were burning. But she did not seem to notice it. She turned back and kissed me, and kissed little Maggie and the baby, and then she went to my aunt's. I watched her out of sight, and then I put on my best clothes and set off for the town." "And what did you do with Maggie and the baby?" said Rosalie. "Did you take them with you?" "No, that's the worst of it," said the girl. "I left them. I put the baby in its crib upstairs, and I told Maggie to look after it, and then I put the table in front of the fire and locked them in, and put the key in the window. I thought I should only be away a short time." "How long were you?" "When I got to the town the procession was just passing, and I stopped to look at it, and when I saw the men and women sitting upon the cars, I thought they were kings and queens. Well, I went to the circus and saw all that there was to be seen, and then I looked at the church clock and found it was 5 o'clock, for the exhibition had not been till the afternoon. I knew my mother would be home, and I did not like to go back. I wondered what she would say to me about leaving the children. So I walked round the circus for some time, looking at the gilded cars which were drawn up in the field, and as I was looking at them, an old man came up to me and began talking to me. He asked me what I thought of the circus, and I told him I thought it was splendid. Then he asked me what I liked best, and I said those ladies in gold and silver who were sitting on the gilt cars. 'Would you like to be dressed like that?' he said. 'Yes, that I should,' I said, and as I looked down at my dress, my best Sunday dress, which I had once thought so smart. 'Well,' he said mysteriously, 'I don't know, but perhaps I may get you that chance. Just wait here a minute and I'll see.' I stood there trembling, hardly knowing what to wish. At last he came back and told me to follow him. He took me into a room, and there I found a very grand lady, at least, she looked like one then. She asked me if I would like to come and be Britannia in the circus and ride on the gilt car." "And what did you say?" asked Rosalie. "I thought it was a great chance for me, and I told her I would stay. I was so excited about it that I hardly knew where I was. It seemed just as if someone was asking me to be a queen. And it was not till I got into bed that I let myself think of my mother." "Did you think of her then?" said Rosalie. "Yes, I couldn't help thinking of her then, but there were 6 or 7 other girls in the room, and I was afraid of them hearing me cry, so I hid my face under the bedclothes. The next day we moved from that town, and I felt very miserable all the time we were traveling. Then the circus was set up again, and we went in the procession." "Did you like that?" asked the child. "No, it was not as nice as I expected. It was a cold day, and the white dress was very thin. And oh, I was so dizzy on that car, it was such a height up, and I felt every moment as if I should fall. And then they were so unkind to me. I was very miserable because I kept thinking of my mother, and when they were talking and laughing I used to cry, and they didn't like that. They said I was very different to the last girl they had. She had left them to be married, and they were looking out for a fresh girl when they met with me. They thought I had a pretty face and would do very well, but they were angry with me for looking so miserable, and found more and more fault with me. They were always quarrelling long after we went to bed. They were shouting at each other. Oh, I got so tired of it, I did wish I had never left home, and then we came to Lesborough, and at last I could bear it no longer. I kept dreaming about my mother, and when I woke in the night I thought I heard my mother's voice. At last I determined to run away. I knew they would be very angry, but no money could make me put up with that sort of life. I was thoroughly sick of it. I felt ill and weary, and longed for my mother. And now I'm going home. I ran away that night they left Lesborough. I got out of the caravan when they were all asleep. I've been walking ever since. I brought a little food with me, but it's all gone now, and how I shall get home I don't know." "Poor Jessie," said little Rosalie. "I don't know what my mother will say when I get there. I know she won't scold me. I shouldn't mind that half so much, but I can't bear to see my mother cry." "She will be glad to get you back," said Rosalie. "I don't know what my mammy would do if I ran away." "Oh, dear," said Jessie, I hope nothing came to those children. I do hope they got no harm when I was out. I've thought about that so often." Then the poor girl seemed very tired, and, leaning against the wall, she fell asleep, whilst Rosalie rested once more against her mother's pillow. And again there was no sound to be heard but the wind sweeping among the dark fir trees. Rosalie was glad to have Jessie there. It did not seem quite so solitary. And at last rest was given to the tired little woman. Her eyes closed, and she forgot her troubles in a sweet, refreshing sleep. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O. F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 11. The Mother's Dream. When Rosalie awoke, her mother's eyes were fixed upon her, and she was sitting up in bed. Her breathing was very painful, and she was holding her hand to her side, as if she were in much pain. The candle had burnt low in the socket, and the early morning light was stealing into the caravan. Jessie was still asleep in the corner, with her head leaning against the wall. "Rosalie," said her mother, under her breath, "where are we, and who is that girl?" "We're half-way to the town, mammy, out on the moor, and that's Britannia." "What do you mean?" asked her mother. "It's the girl we saw riding on that gilt car in Lesborough, and she has run away, she was so miserable there." And then Rosalie told her mother the sad story she had just heard. "Poor thing, poor young thing," said the sick woman. "I'm glad you took her in. Mind you give her a good breakfast. She does well to go back to her mother. It's the best thing she can do. Is she asleep, Rosalie?" "Yes, mammy dear. She went to sleep before I did." "Do you think it would wake her if you were to sing to me?" "No, mammy dear, I shouldn't think so, if I didn't sing very loud." "Then could you sing me your hymn once more? I've had the tune in my ears all night, and I should so much like to hear it." So little Rosalie sang her hymn. She had a sweet, low voice, and she sang very correctly. If she had heard a tune once, she never forgot it. When she had finished singing, Jessie moved and opened her eyes, and looked up with a smile, as if she were in the midst of a pleasant dream. Then, as she saw the inside of the caravan, the sick woman, and Rosalie, she remembered where she was, and burst into tears. "What's the matter?" asked the child, running up to her and putting her arms around her neck. "Were you thinking of your mother?" "No, dear," she said, "I was dreaming." "Ask her what she was dreaming," said Rosalie's mother. "I was dreaming I was at home, and it was Sunday, and we were at the Bible class and singing the hymn we always begin with. I was singing it when I awoke, and it made me cry to think it wasn't true." "Perhaps it was my singing that made you dream it," said Rosalie. "I've been singing to my mammy." "Oh, I should think that was it," said the girl. "What did you sing? Will you sing it to me?" Rosalie sang over again the first verse of the hymn. To her surprise, Jessie started from her seat and seized her by the hand. "Where did you get that?" she asked hurriedly. "That's the very hymn I was singing in my dream. We always sing it on Sunday afternoons at our Bible class." "I have it on a card," said Rosalie, bringing her favorite card down from the wall. "Why, who gave you that?" said the girl. "It's just like mine. Mine has a ribbon in it just that color. Where did you get it?" "We were passing through a village," said Rosalie, "and a kind woman gave it to me. We stopped there about an hour, and she was singing it outside her cottage door." "Why, it must have been our village, surely," said Jessie. "I don't think they have those cards anywhere else. What was the woman like?" "She was a young woman, with a very nice face. She had one little boy, about 2 years old, and he was playing with his ball in front of the house. His mother was so good to us, she gave us some bread and milk." "Why, it must have been Mrs. Barker," said the girl. She lives close to us. Our cottage is just a little farther up the road. She often sings when she's at work, 'To think that you've been to our village. Oh, I wish you'd seen my mother.'" "Do you know Mrs. Leslie?" asked the sick woman, raising herself in bed. "Yes, that I do," said the girl. "She's our clergyman's wife. Such a kind lady. Oh, she is good to us. I'm in her Bible class. We go to the vicarage every Sunday afternoon. Do you know her?" she asked, turning to Rosalie's mother. "I used to know her, many years ago," said the sick woman, "but it's a long, long time since I saw her." Rosalie crept up to her mother's side, and put her little hand in hers, for she knew that the mention of her sister would bring back all the sorrowful memories of the past. But the sick woman was very calm to day. She did not seem at all ruffled or disturbed, but she lay looking at Jessie with her eyes half closed. It seemed as if she were pleased even to look at someone who had seen her sister Lucy. About 6 o'clock Toby came to the caravan door and asked how his mistress was, and if they were ready to start. He was very surprised when he saw Jessie sitting inside the caravan. But Rosalie told him in a few words how the poor girl came there, and asked him in what direction she ought to walk to get to her own home. Toby was very clever in knowing the way to nearly every place in the country, and he said that for 10 miles farther their roads would be the same, and Jessie could ride with them in the caravan. The poor girl was very grateful to them for all their kindness. She sat beside Rosalie's mother all the morning, and did everything she could for her. The effect of the doctor's medicine had passed off, and the sick woman was very restless and wakeful. She was burnt with fever, and tossed about from side to side of her bed. Every now and then her mind seemed to wander, and she talked of her mother and her sister Lucy, and of other things which Rosalie did not understand. Then she became quite sensible, and would repeat over and over again the words of the hymn, or would ask Rosalie to read to her once more about the lost sheep and the Good Shepherd. When the child had read the parable, the mother turned to Jessie and said to her very earnestly, "Oh, do ask the Good Shepherd to find you now, Jessie. You'll be so glad of it afterwards." "I've been so bad," said Jessie, crying. "My mother has often talked to me, and Mrs. Leslie has too, and yet after all I've gone and done this. I daren't ever ask him to find me now." "Why not, Jessie?" said Rosalie's mother. "Why not ask him?" "Oh, he would have nothing to say to me now," said the girl, sobbing, and hiding her face in her hands. "If I'd only gone to him that Sunday." "What Sunday?" asked Rosalie. "It was the Sunday before I left home. Mrs. Leslie talked to us so beautifully. It was about coming to Jesus. She asked us if we had come to him to have our sins forgiven, and she said, 'If you haven't come to him already, do come to him to-day.' And then she begged those of us who hadn't come to him before to go home when the class was over, and kneel down in our own rooms and ask Jesus to forgive us that very Sunday afternoon. I knew I had never come to Jesus, and I made up my mind that I would do as our teacher asked us. But as soon as we were outside the vicarage, the girls began talking and laughing, and made fun of somebody's bonnet that they had seen at church that morning, and when I got home I thought no more of coming to Jesus, and I never went to him, and oh, I wish that I had." "Go now," said Rosalie's mother. "It wouldn't be any good," said the girl sorrowfully. "If I thought it would, if I only thought he would forgive me, I would do anything. I would walk twice the distance home." "He goeth after that which is lost until he find it," said the sick woman. "Are you lost, Jessie?" "Yes," said the girl, "that's just what I am." "Then he is going after you," said Rosalie's mother again. Jessie walked to the door of the caravan and sat looking out without speaking. The sunlight was streaming on the purple heather, which was spread like a carpet on both sides of the road. Quiet little roadside springs trickled through the moss and ran across the path. The travellers had left the pine forest behind, and there was not a single tree in sight. Nothing but large grey rocks, and occasional patches of bright yellow furze amongst the miles and miles of heath-covered moor. At last they came to a large sign-post at a corner where four roads met, and here Toby said Jessie must leave them. But before she went, there was a little whispered conversation between Rosalie and her mother, which ended in Jessie's carrying away in her pocket no less than half of Mother Manikin's present. "You'll need it before you get home, dear," said the sick woman, "and mind you go straight to your mother. Don't stop till you run right into her arms, and when you see Mrs. Leslie, just tell her you met with a poor woman in a caravan, called Norah, who knew her many years ago." "Yes," said Jessie, "I'll tell her." "And say that I sent my respects, my love to her, and tell her I have not very long to live, but the Good Shepherd has sought me and found me, and I am not afraid to die. Don't forget to tell her that." "No," said Jessie, "I'll be sure to remember." The poor girl was very sorry to leave them. She kissed Rosalie and her many times, and as she went down the road she kept turning around to wave her handkerchief till the caravan was quite out of sight. "So those girls knew nothing about it, Rosalie darling," said her mother when Jessie was gone. "Nothing about what, mammy dear?" "Don't you remember the girls that stood by our show when the procession went past? They wished they were Britannia, and thought she must be so happy and glad." "Oh, yes," said Rosalie, "they knew nothing about it. All the time poor Jessie was so miserable she did not know what to do with herself. It's just the mistake I made, Rosalie darling, till I came behind the scenes, and knew how different everything looks when one is there. And so it is, dear, with everything in this world. It is all disappointing and vain when one gets to know it well." As evening drew on, they left the moor behind and turned into a very dark and shady road with trees on both sides of the way. Rosalie's mother was sleeping for the first time since early morning, and Rosalie sat and looked out at the door of the caravan. The wood was very thick, and the long shadows of the trees fell across the road. Every now and then they disturbed 4 or 5 rabbits that were enjoying themselves by the side of the path, and ran headlong into their snug little holes as soon as they heard the creaking of the caravan wheels. Then an owl startled Rosalie by hooting in a tree overhead, and then several wood pigeons cooed mournfully their sad good nights. The road was full of turnings, and wound in and out amongst the wood. Toby whistled a tune as he went along, and Rosalie sat and listened to him, quite glad that he broke the silence. She was not sorry when they left the wood behind and came into the open country, and at last there glimmered in the distance the lights of a village where Toby said they would spend the night. He pulled up the caravan by the wayside and begged a bed for himself in a barn belonging to one of the small village farms. The next day was Sunday. Such a calm, quiet day, the very air seemed full of Sabbath rest. The country children were just going to the Sunday school as the caravan started. Their mothers had carefully dressed them in their best clothes, and were watching them down the village street. The sick woman had had a restless and tiring night. Little Rosalie had watched beside her, and was weary and sad. Her poor mother had tossed from side to side of her bed, and could find no position in which she was comfortable. Again and again the child altered her mother's pillow, and tried to make her more easy, but though the poor woman thanked her very gently, not many minutes had passed before she wanted to be moved again. But the Sunday stillness seemed to have a soothing effect on the sick woman, and as they left the village she fell asleep. For hours that sleep lasted, and when she awoke she seemed refreshed and rested. "Rosalie darling," she said, calling her little girl to her side. "I've had such a beautiful dream." "What was it, mammy dear?" asked Rosalie. "I thought I was looking into heaven, Rosalie dear, in between the bars of the golden gates, and I saw all the people dressed in white walking up and down the streets of the city. And then somebody seemed to call them together, and they all went in one direction, and there was a beautiful sound of singing and joy, as if they had heard some good news. One of them passed close to the gate where I was standing, Rosalie, and he looked so happy and glad as he was hastening on to join the others. So I called him, darling, and asked him what was going on." "And what did he say, mammy dear?" "He said, 'It's the Good Shepherd who has called us. He wants to rejoice with him. He has just found one of the lost sheep which he has been seeking so long. Did not you hear his voice just now when he called us all together? Didn't you hear him saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost"?' And then they all began to sing again, and somehow I knew they were singing for me, and that I was the sheep that was found. And then I was so glad that I woke with joy. And oh, Rosalie darling, I know my dream is true, for I've been asking him to find me again and again, and I'm quite sure that he wanted to do it long before I asked him." "Oh, mammy dear," said Rosalie, putting her hand in her mother's, "I am so glad." Rosalie's mother did not talk any more then, but she lay very quietly, holding Rosalie's hand, and every now and then she smiled as if the music of the heavenly song were still in her ears, and as if she still heard the Good Shepherd saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost." Then they passed through another village, where the bells were ringing for afternoon service, and the sick woman listened to them very sorrowfully. "I shall never go to church again, Rosalie darling," she said. "Oh, mammy," said little Rosalie, "don't talk like that. When you get better we'll go together. We could easily slip into the back seats where nobody would see us." "No, Rosalie," said her mother. "You may go, my darling, but I never shall." "Why not, mammy dear?" "Rosalie," said her mother, raising herself in bed and putting her arm around her child, "don't you know that I am going to leave you? Don't you know that in about a week's time you will have no mother?" Rosalie hid her face in her mother's pillow and sobbed aloud. "Oh, mammy, mammy dear, mammy, don't say that. Please don't say that." "But it's true, little Rosalie," said her mother, "and I want you to know it. I don't want it to take you by surprise. And now stop crying, darling, for I want to talk to you a bit. I want to tell you some things whilst I can speak." "My poor, poor darling," said the mother, as the child continued sobbing. She stroked her little girl's head very gently, and after a long, long time the sobbing ceased, and Rosalie only cried quietly. "Little woman," said her mother, "can you listen to me now?" Rosalie pressed her mother's hand, but she could not answer her. "Rosalie, darling, you won't be sorry for your mother, will you, dear? The Good Shepherd has found me. I'm going to see him, and thank him, darling. You mustn't cry for me, and I want to tell you what to do when I'm dead. I've asked your father to let you leave the caravan and live in some country village, but he won't give his consent, darling. He says he can't spare you. So, dear, you must keep very quiet. Sit in the caravan and read your little Testament by yourself. Don't go wandering about the fair, darling. I've been asking the Good Shepherd to take care of you. I told him you would soon be a little motherless lamb with nobody to look after you, and I asked him to put you in his bosom and carry you along. And I believe he will, Rosalie darling, and I don't think he'll let you get wrong. But you must ask him yourself, my darling. You must never let a day pass without asking him. Promise your mother, Rosalie. Let her hear you say the words." "Yes, mammy dear," said Rosalie, "I promise you." "And if ever you can go to your Aunt Lucy, you must go to her and give her that letter, you remember where it is, and tell her, dear, that I shall see her some day in that city I dreamt about. I should never have seen her if it had not been for the shepherd's love, but he took such pains to find me, and he wouldn't give it up, and at last he put me on his shoulders and carried me home. I am very tired, Rosalie darling, but there is more that I wanted to say. I wanted to tell you that it will not do for you to ask your father about going to your Aunt Lucy, because he would never let you, and he would only be writing to her for more money if he knew where she lived. But if you go through that village again, you might just run up to the house and give her the letter. I don't know if that would do either," said the poor woman sadly, "but God will find you a way. I believe you will get there some day. I can't talk any more now, darling. I am so tired. Kiss me, my own little woman." Rosalie lifted up a very white and sorrowful face, and kissed her mother passionately. "You couldn't sing your little hymn, could you, darling?" said the sick woman. Rosalie tried her very best to sing it, but her voice trembled so that she could not manage it. She struggled through the first verse, but in the second she quite broke down and burst into a fresh flood of tears. Her poor mother tried to soothe her, but was too weak and weary to do more than stroke the child's face with her thin, wasted hand, and whisper in her ears a few words of love. Very sorrowful were poor Rosalie's thoughts as she sat by her mother's bed. She had known before that her mother was very ill, and sometimes she had been afraid as she thought of the future, but she had never before heard that dreadful fear put into words. She had never before known that it was not merely a fear, but a terrible reality. In about a week's time you will have no mother. That was what her mother had told her. And her mother was everything to Rosalie. She had never known a father's love or care. Augustus had never acted as a father to her. But her mother had been everything to her from the day she was born until now. Rosalie could not imagine what the world would be like without her mother. She could hardly fancy herself living when her mother was dead. She would have no one to speak to her, no one to care for her, no one to love her. Words of love thy voice is speaking. Come, come to me. What was it made her think of that just now? Was it not the Good Shepherd's voice, as he held the poor, lonely lamb closer to his bosom? Come, come to me. Good Shepherd, I do come, said little weary Rosalie. I come to thee now. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 12. A Lone Lamb. It was Sunday evening when the caravan reached the town where the fair was to be held. The travellers passed numbers of people in their Sunday clothes, and saw many churches and chapels open for evening service as they drove through the town. The gaily painted caravan looked strangely out of keeping with everything around it on that holy day. Augustus met them as they came upon the common, which was apportioned to the show people. It was a large waste piece of ground on a cliff overlooking the sea, for this great fair was held at a large watering place on the sea coast. The piece of ground which Augustus had selected was close to the beach, so that Rosalie could hear the rolling and dashing of the waves on the rocks below as she sat beside her mother that night. In the morning, as her mother was sleeping quietly, she stole out on the shore and wandered about amongst the rocks before the rest of the show people were awake. A long ridge of rocks stretched out into the sea, and Rosalie walked along this and watched the restless waves as they dashed against it and broke into thick white foam. In some parts the rocky way was covered with small limpets, whose shells crackled under Rosalie's feet. Then came some deep pools filled with green and red seaweed, in which Rosalie discovered pink sea anemones and restless little crabs. She examined one or two of these, but her heart was too sad and weary to be interested by them long. So she wandered on until she reached the extremity of the ridge of rocks. Here she sat for some time, gazing at the breakers and watching the sunshine spreading over the silvery grey waters. Several fishing boats were already entering the port, laden with the spoils of the previous night, and Rosalie watched them coming in one by one and running quickly ashore. One of them passed close by the spot where the child was sitting. An old man and two boys were in it, and they were singing as they went by, in clear, ringing voices. Rosalie could hear the words of the song well, as she sat on the ridge of rocks. "Last night, my lads, we toiled away, oh, so drearily, drearily, but we weighed our anchor at break of day, oh, so cheerily, cheerily. So keep up heart and courage, friends, for home is just in sight, and who will heed, when safely there, the perils of the night? Just so we toil through earth's dark night, oh, so wearily, wearily. Yet we trust to sail at dawn of light, oh, so cheerily, cheerily. So keep up heart and courage, friends, for home is just in sight, and who will heed, when safely there, the perils of the night?" There was something in the wild tune and something in the homely words which soothed Rosalie's heart. As she walked back to the caravan, she kept saying to herself, "So keep up heart and courage, friends, for home is just in sight." "Just in sight, that must be for my mammy," thought the child, "and not for me. She is getting very near home." Her mother was awake when Rosalie opened the caravan door, but she seemed very weak and tired, and all that long day scarcely spoke. The child sat beside her and tried to tempt her to eat, but she hardly opened her eyes and would take nothing but a little water. In the afternoon the noise of the fair began, the rattling of the shooting galleries, the bells of the 3 large whirligigs, and 2 noisy bands playing different tunes and making a strange, discordant sound, an odd mixture of the Mabel waltz and Poor Mary Ann. Then, as the crowds in the fair became denser, the shouts and noise increased on all sides, and the sick woman moaned to herself from time to time. Augustus was far too busy preparing for the evening's entertainment to spend much time in the caravan. He did not know, or he would not see, that a change was passing over his wife's face, that she was even then standing on the margin of the river of death. And thus, about half an hour before the theatre opened, he called to Rosalie to dress herself for the play, and would listen to none of her entreaties to stay with her dying mother. Her dying mother. Yes, Rosalie knew that it had come to that now. Child as she was, she could tell that there was something in her mother's face which had never been there before. Her eyes were opened to the truth at last, and she felt that death was not very far away. How could she leave her? Her mother's hand was holding hers so tightly. Her mother's eyes, whenever they were opened, were fixed on her so lovingly. How could she leave her mother, even for an hour, when the hours which she might still have with her were becoming so few? Yet Rosalie dared not stay. Was not this the great fair her father had been counting on all the year, and from which he hoped to reap the greatest profit? And had he not told her that very night that if she broke down in her part in this town, he would never forgive her as long as he lived? No, there was no help for it. Rosalie must go, but not until the last moment. Not until the very last moment would she leave her dying mother. She dressed very quickly and sat down in her little white dress beside her mother's bed. Once more she held her mother's cold hand, and gently stroked her pale face. "Little Rosalie," said her mother, "my darling, are you going? Must you leave me?" "Oh, mammy, mammy, it is so hard, so very, very hard." "Don't cry, my darling, my little lamb, don't cry. It's all right. Lift me up a little, Rosalie." The child altered her mother's pillows very gently, and then the sick woman whispered, "I'm close to the deep waters. I can hear the sound of them now. It's the river of death, Rosalie, and I've got to cross it. But I'm not afraid. The Good Shepherd has laid me on his shoulder, and as I'm so very weak, I think he'll carry me through." This was said with great difficulty, and when she had done speaking, the dying woman's head fell back on the pillow. Rosalie could not speak. She could only kiss her mother's hand, and cry quietly as she watched. And then came her father's call to her to make haste and come into the theatre, and she had to disengage herself from her mother's hand, and giving one last long look to shut the door and leave her alone. What happened in the theatre that night Rosalie never exactly knew. It all seemed as a horrible dream to her. She said the words and acted her part, but she saw not the stage nor the spectators. Her eyes all the time were on her mother's face. Her hand all the time felt her mother's dying grasp. And yet, as she danced and sang, there were many there who thought her happy, many who envied her, and who would have gladly changed places with her. Oh, if they had only known! If they had only had the faintest idea of the anguish of that little heart, of the keen, cruel, cutting sorrow with which it was filled. Troubles some of these people undoubtedly had, cares and vexations and worries not a few, yet none of them had known anything of the heart misery of that little actress. Not one of them had ever been torn from the side of a dying mother, and been compelled to laugh and sing, when their very hearts were bleeding. From such soul-rending agony they had been saved and shielded, and yet they would have chosen the very lot which would have exposed them to it. Oh, how very little they knew of what was going on behind the scenes! How little they guessed what a tumult of passionate sorrow was in little Rosalie's heart! So wild was her grief that she hardly knew what she was doing, and after the play was over, she could not have told how she managed to get through it. Instead of going out on the platform, she darted swiftly out of the theatre and into her mother's caravan, almost knocking over several people who were passing by, and who stared at her in astonishment. Her mother was not dead. Oh, how glad Rosalie was for that! But she did not seem to hear her speak, and her breathing was very painful. Rosalie bent over her and gave her one long, long kiss, and then hurried back into the theatre just as her father had missed her. And when she came next into the caravan, all was still. Her mother seemed to be sleeping more quietly. The painful breathing had ceased, and the child hoped she was easier. She certainly seemed more restful, and her hands were still warm, so she could not be dead, little Rosalie reasoned to herself. Poor child! She did not know that even then she had no mother. Weary and aching in every limb, little Rosalie fell asleep on the chair by her mother's side. And when she awoke with a shiver in the dead of night, and once more felt her mother's hand, it was as cold as ice, and Rosalie knew then that she was dead. Trembling in every limb, and almost too startled to realize her sorrow, she unfastened the caravan door and crept out into the darkness to tell her father. But he and the men were sleeping soundly on the floor of the little theatre, and though Rosalie hammered against the gilded boards in front, she could make no one hear her. Again and again she knocked, but no answer came from within, for the theatre people were tired with their night's work, and could not hear the tiny little hands on the outside of the show. So the poor child had to return to the desolate caravan. With one bitter cry of anguish, one long, passionate wail of grief, she threw herself on her mother's bed. Her sorrow could not disturb that mother now. She was gone to that land which is very far off, where even the sound of weeping is never heard. The Good Shepherd had carried her safely over the river, and, as Rosalie wept in the dark caravan, he was even then welcoming her mother to the home above. He was even then saying, in tones of joy, yet more glad than before, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost." But Rosalie, poor, little, desolate, motherless Rosalie, had the Good Shepherd quite forgotten her? Was she left in her sorrow alone and forsaken? Was there no comfort for the orphaned lamb in her bitter distress? Did he pass her by untended and unblessed? Or did he not rather draw doubly near in that night of darkness? Did he not care for the lonely lamb? Did he not whisper words of sweetest comfort and love to the weary, sorrowful Rosalie? If not, what was it that made her feel, as she lay on her mother's bed, that she was not altogether deserted, that there was one who loved her still? What was it that gave her that strange, happy feeling that she was lying in the Good Shepherd's arms, and that he was folding her to his bosom even more tenderly than her mother had done? What was it but the Good Shepherd fulfilling those gracious, loving words of his, "He shall gather the lambs with his arms, and carry them in his bosom"? It was the next morning. The sun had risen some time, and the show people were beginning to stir. The fishing boats were once more coming home, and the breakers were rolling on the shore. Augustus Joyce awoke with a strange feeling of uneasiness for which he could not account. Nothing had gone wrong the night before. Rosalie had made no mistake in her part, and his profits had been larger than usual. And yet Augustus Joyce was not happy. He had had a dream the night before. Perhaps that was the reason. He had dreamt of his wife, and it was not often that he dreamt of her now. He had dreamt of her not as she was then, thin and worn and wasted, but as she had been on his wedding day, when she had been his bride, and he had promised to take her, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish her till death should them part. Somehow or other, when Augustus awoke, those words were ringing in his ears. What had he been to her in poverty? How had he treated her in sickness? Had he soothed her and cared for her, and done all he could to make their burden press lightly on her? Had he loved her and cherished her? Loved her? What did those cruel words, those bitter taunts, those unsympathizing speeches tell of the love of Augustus Joyce for his wife? Cherished her? What kind of cherishing had he bestowed upon her during her illness? What kind of cherishing had he shown her when he had compelled her, almost fainting, to take her part in the play? "Till death us do part." That time was very near now. Augustus Joyce knew that. For once the voice of conscience was heard by him. He could not forget the lovely face he had seen in his dream, nor the sad, reproachful gaze of those beautiful dark eyes. He jumped from his bed and dressed hastily. He would give his wife some kind words, at least that morning. Conscience should not taunt him with his bitter neglect again. He hurried to the other caravan, opened the door, and entered. What was the scene which met his gaze? The sunbeams were streaming in through the small window and falling on the bed, and there lay his wife, so pale, so ghastly, so still, that Augustus Joyce drew back in horror. And there, with her arms around her mother's neck, and the wreath of roses fallen from her hair on her mother's pillow, lay little Rosalie, fast asleep, with the traces of tears still on her cheeks. Intense sleep and weariness had taken possession of her, and she had fallen asleep on her mother's bed, in her white dress, just as she had been acting at the play. Augustus drew nearer to his wife, and sat down beside her. Yes, she was dead. There was no doubt of that. The kind words could never be spoken. She would never hear him again. He could never show his love to her now, never cherish her more. Till death us do part. It had parted them now, parted them forever. It was too late for Augustus Joyce to make amends, too late for him to do anything to appease his conscience. When Rosalie awoke, she found herself being lifted from the bed by her father, and carried into the other caravan. There he laid her on his own bed, and went out, shutting the door behind him. And the next few days seemed like one long dreary night to Rosalie. Of the inquest and the preparations for the funeral she knew nothing. She seemed like one in a dream. The fair went on all around her, and the noise and racket made her more and more miserable. What she liked best was to hear the dull roaring of the sea after the naphtha lights were out, and all in the fair was still. For somehow, with the roaring of the waves, the fisherman's song came back to her. So keep up heart and courage, friends, for home is just in sight, and who will heed, when safely there, the perils of the night? And somehow, Rosalie hardly knew why, that song comforted and soothed her. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of A Peep Behind the Scenes by Mrs. O.F. Walton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Abigail Rasmussen in February 2012. Chapter 13. Vanity Fair. "Miss Rosie, dear, can I speak to you?" said Toby's voice, the day before the funeral. "Yes, come in, Toby," said the child mournfully. "I should like to see you, Miss Rosie," said Toby mysteriously. "You won't be offended, will you? But I brought you this." Then followed a great fumbling in Toby's pockets, and from the depths of one of them was produced a large red pocket handkerchief, from which, when he had undone the various knots, he took out most carefully a little parcel which he laid on Rosalie's knee. "It's only a bit of black, Miss Rosie dear," he said. "I thought you could put it on to morrow, and you mustn't mind my seeing after it. There was no one to do it but me." And before Rosalie could thank him, he was gone. When she opened the parcel, she found in it a piece of broad black ribbon and a little black silk handkerchief, the best poor Toby could obtain. Rosalie's tears fell afresh as she fastened the ribbon on her hat to be ready for the sorrowful service on the morrow. The fair was nearly over, yet some of the shows lingered, and there were still crowds of children round the whirligigs and shooting galleries when the mournful procession went by. The children at first drew back in astonishment. It was an unexpected sight, a coffin on the fair ground. But astonishment soon gave way to curiosity, and they crowded round the little band of mourners and followed them nearly to the cemetery. Augustus went through the service with an unmoved face. Conscience had been making its final appeal the last few days, and had made one last and mighty effort to arouse Augustus Joyce to repentance. But he had stifled conscience, suppressed it, trampled on it, extinguished it. God's Holy Spirit had been resisted and quenched already, and the conscience of the impenitent sinner was seared as with a hot iron. All the company of the theatre followed Augustus Joyce's wife to the grave, and more than one of them felt unusually moved as they looked at little sorrowful Rosalie walking by her father's side. She was quite calm and quiet, and never shed a tear until the service was over, and she was walking through the quiet cemetery a little behind the rest of the party. Then her eyes fell upon Toby, who was walking near her, with an air of real heartfelt sorrow on his honest face. He had tied a piece of crape round his hat, and a black handkerchief round his neck, out of respect for his late mistress, and for his mistress's little daughter. Something in the curious way in which the crape was fastened on, something in the thought of the kindly heart which had planned this token of sympathy, touched Rosalie, and brought tears to her eyes for the first time on that sorrowful day. For sometimes, when a great sorrow is so strong as to shut up with a firm hand those tears which would bring relief to the aching heart, a little thing, a very little thing, perhaps only a flower which our lost one loved, or something she touched for the last time, or spoke